In this story, you can be anyone, a hero who will become famous everywhere, a knight commanding hundreds of soldiers. You can become a rich man who owns untold treasures, or you can be a thief who steals these treasures, or even a king. This is a miracle of virtual reality, where everyone can enjoy a fantasy world that gives a 100% sense of reality. It's a perfect new fantasy world where anyone can do anything and be anyone, and you can connect to it using capsules. One of these interested people, a pumped-up and strong guy, looked thoughtfully at the advertisement. He was sure that now he could fulfill his dream and open a flower shop. During another training session with his friend, this guy told him about his idea, to which he was skeptical. Despite the stunning news, the guys continued to train, and the jock asked his friend not to shout, although the owner of the club had already left. He then added that he really didn't want to start a conversation with his father, who owned the sports club, about the flower shop. The guy replied that his friend's father, who considers himself a real man, actually hates flower shops. But the muscle man named Jeho actually liked them, which you couldn't tell from his serious face, which was always like that, even when the guy was in a good mood. At that moment, the boy asked him why he didn't just continue practicing hand-to-hand combat that his father taught him, because with such a face, people can't even look him in the eyes. This became clear even during high school, something Jeho rarely talked about. 5 years ago, he was an ordinary high school student named Hwang Jaiho, but at the same time, he often dealt with rude people. One of them burst into the office and started looking for the so-called boss. The man wanted to warn his boss that he needed permission to run his business and that the gym was suspicious. But in front of them sat only a guy with headphones who did not hear how these strange men threatened him and told him to pay them in order to continue doing business. But the guy didn't take the headphones out of his ear, which made the man very angry, and he went up to him to do it himself. But as soon as the man touched the administrator's shoulder, he stood up to his full height, turning out to be much taller than they thought. Both bandits stared at the huge, muscular guy looking down at them. He turned to them and welcomed them to Urama, a health and fitness center, and then apologized for not hearing them. The man hesitated and said he wanted to register at the gym. Naturally, there was no talk of money anymore, since there was no point in getting involved with this muscle man, so Hwang Jaiho simply took 60,000 won from them for a membership. This further memory evoked interesting emotions in the guy, but he did not show them, remaining constantly gloomy. Then his friend said that the problem wasn't even his appearance, since the flowers withered as soon as they were in Jaeho's hands, who also had allergies, and besides, he and the flowers had nothing in common. Moreover, they say that the new world will give all kinds of opportunities, but no one started building their own flower shop. But Jaeho replied that it doesn't matter to him what people do, because some people just go fishing there. But his friend asked what he was going to do if the owner found out about this, and it would be visible, since in the capsule you can lose your muscle mass. Turning off the treadmill, Jaeho replied that he couldn't buy one now, but if he got back on his feet, he would save up money for a deposit to rent a separate apartment and put the capsule there. Moreover, it would be possible to take out a loan for this, but there are special rooms equipped with capsules. Then Jaeho's friend invited him to come with him to the capsule room, since he himself had only recently started playing. Jaeho was surprised by this proposal, but was happy and excited, which did not escape his friend, who, unlike the others, could read at least some emotions on Jaeho's face. They eventually arrived at the capsule room, but Jaeho was acting weird and constantly looking around, as if he was afraid of being seen. His friend told him to just look around and not worry. Jaeho just needs to do everything according to his instructions. First, the starting point in the game will be Kruma. This is a desert. Jaeho was worried that he would definitely not open his store in the desert, but his friend replied that this place would be more preferable for noobs, so-called beginners, since the initial level is not difficult. First, it would be right to raise the level, and only then think about the store. But then the guy noticed that his friend was choosing not the desert, but the rock forest, and excitedly said that if he chose this location, he might not even start playing. Jaeho, surprised, though you couldn't tell from his face, turned and looked at his friend, who added that the Forest of Rocks was known for the fact that many newbies died there, and if you lost your character there, it would be simply impossible to create a new one. The guy saw this on the forum where it was said that training a second character, or reinitializing a character, was blocked due to him dying in the forest. There are crazy elves there that prevent you from completing even the initial quests. If only you pay a few million gold, then some high-ranking character will be able to save the newbie and carry him away on his back. But no matter how much Jaeho's friend tried to dissuade and scare the guy, he seemed to ignore these words. His gaze remained just as serious and calm. He mumbled something to himself and lay down in the capsule, barely fitting in. Then the guy's friend suggested that he change the capsule, or rather its size. But Jaeho replied that he was fine with it. Then his friend, closing the capsule, shouted goodbye that he should never go into the Forest of Rocks because he simply wouldn't be able to get out of there and would ruin the whole game. At the last second, the boy shouted out his ID so that Jaeho could find him in Kurma's location. Jaeho, lying in the capsule, was only thinking about what the new VR would feel like. Here the system gave out character settings, radical changes to which were blocked, but they were not needed by Jaeho, who just wanted to be ordinary. The guy then chose his ID and launched the game. There he was called Alshia, the starting location of which became the Forest of the Rock, where noble elves lived. Alshia decided to immediately call his friend, Van Sick. Jeho immediately received a notification that Muscles Baba wanted to talk to him. When they saw each other's IDs, the guys hesitated, since they did not match their appearance at all. The name Alshia did not match Jeho's face at all, as did his friend's name and his nickname. Then, Muscles Bang Bang, or the same Vansik, decided to ask Jeho where he is, since he does not see him in the location of the Kurma. But soon the guy realized that his friend had gotten into the rock. This made him very angry, but Alshia began to justify herself by saying that the game was probably lagging, or that the server was faulty, which Vansik did not believe, since it was impossible. But suddenly a notification from the system popped up, warning Jeho that it had blocked the user Muscles Bang Bang, after which the guy sighed with relief, since he did not want to hear his friends whining. Looking at the bushes with flowers, Alshia decided that I was the right choice. He did not know what was written on the forum, but he did not see any people here, but there were many flowers. This made the guy happy, but first he decided to try moving in this body in order to fully master it. He began to warm up, but he didn't know that all this time someone was watching him, hiding behind a tree. It was a stranger in a black robe who saw Jeho as nothing more than a new victim. He was sure that the guy would join their worldwide rock organization, Chanrakyop. He started to approach Jeho from behind, but the guy felt him approaching and turned around. He looked at the stranger with surprised eyes and asked him to wait a little. He then stood up to his full height, making him noticeably taller than the man in the robe, and then said that they could begin now. The stranger was surprised by the guy's height and his muscles, which was evident from his frightened face, which showed that he no longer wanted to start anything. Here the stranger bowed, apologizing for the disturbance and adding that he did not want any problems for himself, after which he very quickly disappeared. Jeho first thought it was a training NPC, but it turned out to be an enemy who was also a member of some Chanrakyop. But it didn't matter to him, because he was free to do whatever he wanted, after which the guy turned around and stared at the beautiful blue flowers. His idea of opening a flower shop became truly possible for him in this world, absorbing his head, so he even began to look at flowers with a slightly crazy look. After examining it, he decided to sniff the smells around him. He took a deep breath, noticing that he had no allergies, even though there were only flowers around. It used to be a problem, but now he can pick these flowers and put them on his hand. The sense of touch in this game was just great. It was like heaven for Jeho, who could finally touch and smell flowers without any consequences. Suddenly, the guy heard a strange sound, similar to a system notification. The notification said that he had gained the skill of plant knowledge. Now, after examining a plant, he can find out its name. This skill was excellent for Jeho, who was very happy to have it, although you couldn't tell from his face. Jeho, after a few minutes, raised the level of this skill to level 5, and now he could raise the gathering level. After this, he achieved the achievement of a simple-minded observer, which was that if there were flowers around, the speed of movement increased. Then, Jeho got the achievement of a flower lover, which increased the loyalty of strangers, and then a novice botanist, which allowed him to record all the information about the observed plant in the reference book. This was exactly what the guy had dreamed of all his life. He joyfully raised his hands up and shouted that his dream had finally come true. At the same time, in the forest, the rocks began to play other victims, one of whom was the girl May. People warned her not to start from this place, but she was very attracted to the elves. Although it is difficult to start here because there are no people, in her opinion, this has its advantages. For example, she would be able to make friends with elves. This was her dream, and the thought of it delighted her. Then May heard a strange rustling sound behind her, thinking that it was the elves. She thought happily that she was lucky to have stumbled upon them right away. She hid in the bushes and peeked out from behind a tree. But instead of elves, she saw a huge pumped-up guy in the clearing, who for some reason was shouting loudly with his hands raised up. This surprised the girl very much, and she decided to continue watching, thinking that there was a real monster in front of her. 5 minutes later, she left a message on the forum that in the Forest of Rocks she noticed some crazy scary monster or NPC who was giggling and screaming alone. But the network did not support May, saying that it was stupid for a newbie to choose this location, so it looks like her account is fake. Moreover, in this location, all the NPCs are elves. At this time, Jeho, sitting on the grass around the flowers, decided to look at the directory and open the system notification, after which she gave him a large book, which must have already contained quite a lot of different plants. He decided to leaf through this reference book and open it in the place he needed, after which he had to touch the desired page, after which a notification immediately popped up in front of him, which told about the flowers of Ifelchi and the woody vine of Physalis, which grew in this location. After closing the directory, Jeho thought that it would be great to fill in all the data in it, which meant he needed to explore the forest more. Getting up, Jeho decided to go forward to carry out his plan. On his little journey, he found a mist flower, clover, and other flowers, after which he raised his head and wondered if he had gone too far. Then something very interesting caught his eye. It was a flower that looked like a common dandelion. He flew in from a bright grove located nearby. Jeho decided to head there to check out what was interesting there. What he saw shocked him as he came out into a large clearing strewn with beautiful blue flowers. It turned out that there was a whole field of Eifelchi flowers here. But something caught the guy's attention and he stared at one of the flowers. Its bud was closed, unlike the other flowers, making it the only flower with a bud. Jeho thought it was very strange since only one flower was closed. But why was this flower the only one that couldn't be bred? Then the guy sat down and decided to take a closer look at this flower, which reminded him of the old days. Once upon a time, he observed one of the unbloomed flowers in a flower bed in exactly the same way. He was a second-year high school student at the time, but this flower made him nervous and worried. Then he promised himself that he would take care of this bud so that it would bloom. Jeho watered it every day, observing the flower's reaction. He even played classical music for him from his phone because he had read somewhere that it promoted plant growth. In desperation, Jeho even encouraged him with human words, wishing him luck. Imagine his joy when he noticed that the bud had begun to open a little. Jeho was very happy that his efforts were not in vain. But suddenly someone's foot, wearing a sneaker, stepped right on this flower, which led to its immediate death. Jeho couldn't believe his eyes and stood silently, shocked. That impudent Ilchin turned to the sad Jeho and asked if the rumors that he was growing poisonous flowers in that flower bed were true. But the bully didn't have time to finish because his actions had serious consequences. That day, everyone cried, the flowers, Jeho, and Ilchin. Jeho actually failed that day, but he was determined to succeed this time. He will allow this flower, like all other flowers, to scatter its seeds. Suddenly, the guy noticed another system notification that popped up in front of him. It said that he had found an Eifelchi flower that had never bloomed. This information surprised Jeho very much, but at the same time she inspired him, because he was tired of learning from his father, and now he would show him the will of a man who would do everything without support, as his father always wanted. And yet, this first-level Eifelchi flower, which had never bloomed, seemed strange to the guy, even though his knowledge of it had only progressed 10%. Jeho thought about this for an hour, wondering why this flower wasn't classified as a new species in the reference book. So maybe it was just another form of the same species. He knew he couldn't just sit and watch, he needed information. So he finally decided to get up on his feet and do something, after which he took off and headed to the starting city. After 3 hours of playing, Jeho finally started playing like a normal player, fulfilling his mission. Eventually, he reached the elven village of Trion, where he could rest. One of the reasons why the Forest of Rocks was difficult was that the village of elves hostile to humans is the starting point. But hey, it's just a game. Suddenly, Jeho noticed 2 elves standing nearby staring at him. They immediately ordered the guy to stop and warned him that he would not take a single step into their village. Jeho tried to justify himself because he didn't think it would be that bad. Then the elf turned to her friend and said that he was a fool for talking to monsters. You don't need to talk to them, you need to attack them, which is what they did, surprising Jeho even more. He didn't want to hurt anyone, but the fact that he was considered a monster didn't go unnoticed, and the guy got angry, which made his face become angrier, and he really did look like a monster. Then the alpha's fist flew straight towards Jeho, but the guy was able to easily dodge this blow. This greatly surprised the elf, who clearly did not expect this. But Jeho replied that his ability to dodge attacks was enough to avoid a punch. This was something his father had taught him a long time ago. The guy remembered how his dad made him do 300 push-ups. He trained him to hold his position and not change his stance 100 times. He shouted at his son to stay alert, as he was going to be a great fighter. All of this was not easy to accomplish, and it took incredible willpower from the boy. And now some elf was definitely not an obstacle for him. Jeho's abilities in this new world have proven useful to him. Even with such great strength, there is no sense of reality in the fight. He can't dodge properly, and he doesn't want to cause much damage. But he could counterattack even though he didn't know the level of strength in that body, making this game quite extreme physically. The elf was frightened when he noticed that a blow was flying at him with all its force. Who knows what would have happened if that blow had worked? But the system transmitted via notification that due to the difference in the opponent's levels, no damage was done. The elf noticed that the guy's movements were quite good, and his girlfriend, who had been standing to the side all this time, could not believe that there was such a monster in this forest. Looking at the girl with an offended expression, Jeho said that he couldn't be a monster and that they were just making fun of him. The elves were surprised that the monster spoke, and in such an offended tone that it made them think that he was the devil. But Jeho began to prove that he was a man, namely, an immortalian. In the New World, this was the designation for players who would die and would not be able to resurrect, unlike NPCs. The elves were surprised that this player was not immortal. But what surprised them most was Jeho's face, which always had a very rude expression. Then they decided to sniff to see if the guy really was an immortalian. Jeho immediately distanced himself from the elves, saying that it was not nice to do that because he was taking a shower after training. But the elves sensed something else, namely the scent of the Eifelchi flower. Here the achievement of the flower lover worked, thanks to which the guy achieved a positive effect that also extended to the elves, so they believed him. But Jeho replied that he wasn't going to fight anyway and just wanted to know about the Eiffelchi flowers. The elf girl replied that this flower was the most common flower in the rock, but they were curious as to why this huge guy was so interested in it. Jeho shyly replied that he just wanted to grow flowers, which the elves didn't believe at first. The girl said that he was definitely deceiving them, but the elf decided not to be so categorical. Then, Jeho decided to tell them about the Eiffelchi flower, which had never bloomed, and because of which he had set himself such an interesting goal. The elves looked at him in surprise, and their faces began to express almost panic. The guy couldn't understand why they were behaving like this and what happened. Then the system notification appeared again, stating that Alshia had survived the battle with a superior enemy and had increased his reputation. And while the guy was dealing with the elves, May was reading the comments to her post as well as information about the Forest of Rocks, where users were telling about their negative experiences, and scammers wanted to lure them there, saying that they found a restoration potion. The girl was inside the game for 2 hours, and the system notified her that excessive use of games can interfere with normal daily life, but she wanted to learn more about the forest. So she realized that she definitely met neither a monster nor an NPC in the clearing, but who was it then? May had hoped that when she got to Treant Village, she would definitely make friends with the cute elf along the way, but it turned out to be more difficult than she thought. So she got to the training quest and learned that elves do not like strangers, so it is better to be friends with them. So you need to befriend 10 elves, which was the task, the reward for which was 20 healing mushrooms. This task delighted May, but suddenly she heard strange sounds. A sparkle of excitement awoke in her eyes, and she hoped to see the elf behind her. Out of the corner of her eye, she actually noticed an elf with jet black hair, which looked truly cute. The elf stared in surprise at the girl, who didn't know where to start the conversation. But suddenly she turned around and winked at the elf, saying hello to him and inviting him to eat ramen together, as she thought he was a real cutie. But the elf seemed not to notice her, and walked past. May's heart was broken, and she took it as a rejection and a reproach towards her. It was very strange because she even winked at the end. Was it really that bad? But the girl decided not to despair and headed deeper into the village because there were still many elves there. She tried to greet another elf, but he ignored her. The system immediately reported that the resident of the village, Straw, was not comfortable with her, which meant that interest in her was lowered. She tried to convince the villagers that she was a good person, but another villager of Saris ignored her, so the interest in her was lowered even more. Eventually, it got to the point where the friendliness of the residents dropped to 0, meaning May could even be attacked, but that was to be expected. Then a man in a robe came out of the bushes and, recognizing the girl as a newcomer, invited her to join his worldwide organization of Rocky. He also added that they were inviting strong newcomers to serve their organization. But then May and the man in the robe froze, hearing the sound of the flute. Then they both turned around to find the source of the sound. The next second, their eyes were filled with surprise and misunderstanding. In front of them stood Jeho, accompanied by 2 elves who were chatting cheerfully with him. Mi recognized Jeho, whom she had previously mistaken for a monster, but to her surprise, he turned out to be an ordinary player. Jeho himself could not believe that the elves themselves had taken him to the village to talk about the Eiffelchi flower, which had never bloomed. At first, Jeho didn't understand where they were taking him, and he wasn't sure that everything would be okay, since the elves were too upset about an ordinary flower. But he still continued to follow the elves to their village. They brought the boy to the elder of the village of Tyrant. Jeho thought that he was definitely not an opponent to the elder, which meant it could be dangerous, since he could simply be taken hostage, so he needed to think of a way to escape in advance. At the end of the stairs, the guy noticed a throne, and the elf, pointing at it with his hand, said that this was their elder. Then the elf turned to him and said that he had brought an Imothalion who knew about the Eiffelchi flower, which had never bloomed. The elder turned out to be a woman named Elda, who was alarmed by this information. The elf wanted to add a little to clarify the situation, but Jeho himself broke forward. Sweating with excitement, he decided to make a statement, thinking that before he was attacked, he needed to put everything in its place. And then Jeho told him how much he loved flowers and about his dream of opening a flower shop. The elves listened to him with amazement and even delight. The boy spoke passionately about his dream to the elves, and the crowd grew due to the increased interest of the residents. He devoted himself entirely to the speech, emphasizing that he was alone and needed help, after which he decided to evaluate the situation around him. The system told him that the elves favored him because of his sincere love for flowers and were touched by his warm and kind heart. Moreover, they understand that it is not worth judging by appearances, and they open their souls to the guy's heart because they are touched by his story. But suddenly someone coughed behind Jeho, drawing attention to themselves. It was the elder who said that Jeho was a truly funny person and she was glad to meet him. Then the boy, hesitating, replied that his name was Alshia. Elder Elda really liked the boy's name because, in her opinion, it was as beautiful as his heart. Why did it seem that Alshia was telling the truth when he saw this flower? This statement interested the guy since anyone could see it. He stared at the elder with a still awkward but firmer gaze. A new system notification appeared above this woman, which offered him a quest to change his profession. First, she said that the same Eifelchi flower is closely connected with the legend of the elves. The task was to help the flower bloom. As a reward, you could get the profession of a shaman who could talk to spirits, but if you failed the task, you could no longer change the profession. Elder Elda said that the shaman is respected by all elves, since Shaman Tillet is the creator of the Forest of Rocks. Hearing the name of this shaman, Jeho seemed to remember something. Elda added that this shaman grew a forest of rock here, although this place was previously a desert. This man also helped their wandering elves to stop here to catch their breath, and even found something bigger. Then the boy asked with interest where this shaman was now, but the elder replied that, unfortunately, 200 years ago he died in the arms of nature, and, unlike them, he was a man. But he died here, in the Forest of the Rocks, which was a worthy end to his wanderings. The first flowers were planted in the desert. Then Jeho was able to draw an analogy between this shaman and a flower that never bloomed. Elda agreed with his suspicions and added that if the boy completed this task, he would acquire a new profession of shaman and become a hope for the elves who roamed the entire continent. It was too serious a statement, which left Jeho stunned. But Elda approached the guy and asked him with all her heart to complete this task. He thought for a moment and stared at the sky, as he was clearly not ready for such responsibility. But the elder pierced him with her glances and was also very worried. But Jeho couldn't give an answer for a very long time and began to sweat even more from the tension. The biggest question that was troubling him was about opening a flower shop and whether he would be able to open it if he became a shaman. Elda looked at him with alarm and surprise when the guy voiced his concerns. Alshia finally replied that it was very important for him to open a flower shop. He then hesitated because he was thinking out loud and told the elder that he had come here only for his own purpose. But then Elda said that even if he were a future shaman, his goal would be achievable. She remembered that Tillit Nim said the same thing and also loved flowers very much. Jeho then thanked the elder for the wonderful conversation and the information she had given him. Smiling, Elda said that she was now certain that Tillit had chosen Alshia correctly to pass on his legacy. The boy, embarrassed, scratched his head and said that he was not yet a shaman and that he did not know if this would work. But the elder replied that he had been chosen to find the will of Tillit, hidden in this forest. She also added that Alshia has a natural scent, which says a lot. The guy still had doubts, as he was not sure that everything would be okay. Well, in the end, he pulled himself together and decided to set off. The elder told him that she was eagerly awaiting his results. The system immediately notified the owner that he had accepted the quest to change his profession. All this seemed to happen outside the game. To understand this, it is also worth mentioning the #1 company in the world that serviced and controlled the New World. Worldwide, a company created in Korea that became the developer of an artificial intelligence called Crater. The history and life of the New World was created by the artificial intelligence Crater, which wrote a script for many thousands of years. Crater is the god of the New World, ruling and controlling everything. The production department's interference in the game is completely blocked. The production department's task is to prevent Crater from breaking. Compared to the many departments in the company, this department of the observation and study team was small, but something happened in it. One of the employees ran and called for his leader, Lee Hyunho. He burst into the office and shouted that they had a problem. For the first time since its opening, Crater has sent out a notification about an SSS rank event. Lee Hyunho said that he himself had just found out everything, and it was a real quest for a shaman. The worker was surprised because it was a legendary class and no one in this world could open it yet. But Lee Hyunho smiled and replied with concern that there was now a new rank. Now their main responsibility is to keep an eye on that new player named Alshia. It is worth better understanding the New World, where classes are divided into 3 levels: common, rare, and unique classes. At the beginning, everyone has a common level class, and depending on how a person plays, he can increase his level. It is even possible to reach a class of unique level, but no one has managed to achieve this yet. Usually players didn't even think about getting this class. There is also a top level, legendary. If you reach it, the player will become a legend in the New World, but there was a hidden meaning in the consistent growth process. As Elda already said, they can't help get the Shaman class. This test is from Tillit for Alshia. But there is the next level after the Shaman. It's the successor. And now, Jeho was just trying to achieve his goal of becoming a unique class player, but he had studied the Ifelchi flower by 20%. The plant knowledge skill didn't give him much information now, but he still thought the definition of a flower was a bit strange. Jeho thought that he could level up by studying normal flowers in Ifelchi and thus get more hints, which seemed like the best option to him. Then he took in his hand a flower that he had seen before, and which looked like a dandelion. He knew there were too many of these flowers in the forest, but this way he could watch the Eifelchi grow, just like he did in high school. He watched a small sprout that had appeared only 2 days ago. A week later, the flower grew and a bud formed on it. 2 weeks later, the bud has opened, forming a flower. This means that a normal Eifelchi flower needs 2 weeks to fully bloom. It's longer than Alshia expected, but it seems like his skill is growing quickly, and he's now learned 30% of this flower. Thus, the plant knowledge skill reached level 10, so now the boy could know the name of the plant he was studying and its collection level. The skill level increased, and with it the possibilities increased, which made the guy happy, and now he could check the condition of the observed plant. At first, he didn't understand what the system meant when it talked about checking the condition of the plant. He then decided to use his knowledge of plants to study the Eifelchi flower. But the system did not provide any additional information about this flower, which puzzled Jeho. But then, thanks to checking the condition of the plant, the guy found out that for several days in a row, it had been experiencing horror, feeling the evil gaze of a person on itself. Jeho realized that this skill meant reading the internal state of flowers, which was surprising to him. But then it dawned on him what exactly this flower was talking about, and he was horrified. After all, the strange man who had been looking at him all this time was Jeho himself. Turning around, the guy realized that there really was no one else around. Then he looked awkwardly at the flower and decided to show a kind gesture after all. The guy leaned over to him and said hello nicely, but his sullen face didn't help the situation. Jeho was well aware of this and grabbed his head in panic because he thought that no matter how he looked at it, he looked like a fool. But then an interesting thought came into the guy's head, and he froze for a second. He decided to try to talk to the flower anyway, because if he didn't do it, he would never know if the information about the flower was true, where it was said that it had consciousness and feelings, but it was not a person. Then the parent leaned towards the flower again and introduced himself as Alshia, adding that if anyone saw him talking to the flower, they would think he was crazy, but he still looked forward to the time when the flower would finally bloom. 2 months passed after this incident, and the following events took place again in the Urim Hall. Jeho's friend, hearing this story from him, thought that he had gone crazy. While lifting the dumbbell, the guy said in surprise that instead of opening a flower shop in this game, Jeho had somehow been talking to a flower for 2 months, which contradicts his own goal. If this is really true, then Jeho is even crazier than his friend thought. But, turning to his friend, Jeho said that he had spent this time usefully, and now the Eifelchi flower had gotten rid of the feeling of fear and sympathized with the guy. But Jeho's friend still didn't understand why he received this task, the class of which might not even exist, which meant that he could just, like a real fool, talk to a flower for 2 months. Jeho turned to his friend and said that it was hard to explain, but he thought he would feel it himself soon. The guy's friend wrote it all off as a strange obsession, but Jeho suggested that it was willpower, and if he didn't try, he wouldn't lose, but he wouldn't win either. But the boy replied that the word obsession was more appropriate for Jeho in his situation, especially after hearing him not only talk to the flower, but also understand that he liked the sounds of Sverli and Dew. Thanks to this, Jeho learned new skills and leveled up. His friend simply couldn't believe it and looked at Jeho questioningly. An awkward silence ensued between them after the guy decided to find out what Jeho's character level was, thinking that he was already above 30. In fact, the guy was in no hurry to share this information with his friend, and replied that it was a secret. The next time he entered the new world, Alshia was only level 4, but he wanted to see the level 3 plant quest. The system gave him all his skills and his growth buff, which was plus 5%. But his florist skill was at level 23, which allowed him to speed up the plant's growth time by 6.9%. The landscape skill had been upgraded to level 12, and thus the boy could briefly learn about the nutrient status of the plant he was studying. The elven flute ability was developed to level 8, which allowed positive results to be obtained for the condition of plants within a radius of 3 meters, but this ability could only be used once a day. This seemed like a pretty good result to Alshia. He was sure that Wansik would be surprised by his level, since his skill levels were quite high. Then he, inspired, raised his hands up and decided to start his daily work. Sitting down by the flower, the guy asked it how his last night went, and added that they would have a good time today too, since Jeho decided to tell the flower about his father. Thus, Jehuna spent time with the Eifelchi flower. He could lie next to him and talk about different topics, looking at the sky. He could play the flute for him, which he was already doing quite well. He did this until darkness fell, until the night enveloped the clearing and the sky was covered with stars. Then Jeho would stand up and say goodbye to the flower, saying that they would see each other tomorrow. But then a system notification appeared that the Eifelchi flower, which had never bloomed, regretted having to part with its friend. Jeho looked at the flower questioningly, as this was the first time he had seen such a notification. Then a new notification popped up saying that this flower wanted to follow Alshia, after which the guy noticed that its bud seemed to start glowing and opened a little. At one point, the petals of the bud opened completely, meaning that the flower that had never bloomed had finally bloomed, which greatly shocked Jeho. This flower was truly beautiful, as its buds seemed to glow with a pleasant blue light. The guy still couldn't believe what he saw and stood there, not daring to move. The buds began to burn brighter and brighter, as if a bright beam had not flown out of it. Jeho was sure that these were not spores, but some strange ball of light, of which there was more than one. This glowing ball behaved as if it were alive. He found himself right next to the guy's hands, who suddenly noticed a new notification telling him that he had passed the Shaman test from Tillit, and now he could change his class to Shaman. Jeho was incredibly happy that he had finally completed this quest, and when the system asked him whether he should change his class, the guy enthusiastically answered that he agreed to become a Shaman. The bright flash of light that was in the guy's hand suddenly became even brighter, after which it transformed into a beam of light that headed towards Jeho's chest and hit it, as if possessing his body. Thus, it dawned on the boy that this bright light had entered his chest. This meant that the spirit energy had passed to him, and he had obtained the seed of the divine tree, which helped him unlock the skill for the Shaman class. Looking at his hands as if they were magical, Jeho still seemed to not believe what was happening. And all because he did not feel any changes inside himself, which seemed annoying to him, since he was hoping for something else, at least for a new sensation. But he decided not to despair and see what new skill he had unlocked for the Shaman class. The first special skill was the ability to speak with spirits. The second skill was level 1 growth speed, which increased the growth speed of the plant being studied by 100%. These skills satisfied Jeho quite well, who happily realized that it was his own willpower that helped him complete this quest, and only now did he feel this taste of the game. The spirit of life in Alcia's body was now singing and laughing. Jeho put his hand on his heart and thought about his special skills as a shaman. He was especially struck by his ability to speak to spirits, which made him seem like an elf. He heard the spirit inside him laughing, and he thought that now he would be able to talk to it, because this spirit had merged with him. But then a new system notification appeared again, which caught Jeho's attention. There were words from the spirit of life that said that he could speak, but he was a little shy. Jeho thought that this strange spirit looked like a boar. Then the guy decided to open his inventory and see what he got. It was a mythical grade divine tree seed whose conditions for use were unknown. The seed was wrapped in a hard, thick shell and gave off a barely noticeable aroma, while inside this shell there was something hidden. At the same time, it was huge in size and did not look like an ordinary seed at all. Jeho then decided to look at his already existing skills, which had been transferred to class skills, so he didn't feel any difference. But thanks to the life spirit's ability, the effectiveness of his skills had increased. The spirit of life was sealed in an Eifelchi flower that never bloomed. All class skills, thanks to the spirit of life, receive additional buffs and additional experience, the effectiveness of which increased by 5%. After thinking about it, Jeho came to the conclusion that the changes were not that big, but they were there. This was especially noticeable in the reaction of the elves, who were sure that their shaman had come for the second time, which is why they decided to celebrate it all night. For Jeho, it was strange. Why were the elves happier than he was? But while the elves were celebrating, other people were quietly watching the festival in the bushes, not understanding what had happened, but knowing that this holiday had started because of Jeho changing classes. They were from the World Organization of Rakshi, which is called Chanrakep for short. Around last month, a newcomer named May joined the organization. The girl asked what quest Jeho had completed, but her partner didn't know anything herself and thought that the elves were simply scared by that scary face. Looking at Jeho's face, even when he was smiling, one could definitely sense the emotion of fear. But, in May's opinion, the elves shouldn't approach this scary guy if they are so scared. Also, every time she saw him, he was always surrounded by some flowers. People here don't trust anyone, but he somehow broke that trend. But then, behind the girls, they heard hard male steps. It was probably Chief Jongrakep who said he had a plan, but he needed to follow this player first. The headman dreamed of paying the guy back for his insult, and he would do it for the sake of their existence in the forest of rocks. The leader still remembered how Jeho made him apologize and run away from him. But other members of the organization did not know about this and preferred to support their leader in everything. Only May doubted this idea, all the time looking at the clearing. She looked intently at Jeho and didn't understand why the elves loved him so much. He really looked scary and very menacing, but the elf girl who stood next to him looked at him with eyes full of delight. Maybe, despite his appearance, he is a kind person. At this time, the celebration continued. The songs played louder, the fire grew bigger. Jeho wore flower beads that he made himself because he needed to match his inner state and new status. Looking at these flowers, Elder Elda complimented the boy and said that they looked simply amazing. Alcia replied that he made them because he really liked it. The elder chuckled and said that this was indeed a good answer for a shaman. Then Jeho decided to say that he still didn't really understand what it meant to be a shaman. Elda understood his problem, as it probably arose because there was very little information about shamans in the world, so the guy first needed to learn both histories of the continent. Jeho admitted that he knew very little about this world and their continent. Then, Elda decided to begin the story. The original hometown of the elves was a beautiful place called the Forest of Risellen. They lived under the protection of the Mother of the Divine Tree. Hearing this, Jeho also remembered the divine tree seed he received when he completed the quest. But the elder added that 300 years ago, due to a war in the desert, the elves were on the verge of extinction. At that time, the divine tree sacrificed itself to save them all. As a result, the forest of Risellen was depleted, and the elves scattered wherever their eyes looked in search of a better life. Jeho listened to this story in silence, but he was surprised by the fact that the forest had become depleted precisely because of the war in the desert. Initially, the relationship between elves and humans was neither good nor bad. But then people united with demons, which became the starting point for the fight against them. The demons destroyed the forests of Risellen and attacked the divine tree, destroying many elves. Since then, the elves became hostile to humans, and it was very difficult for them to regain each other's trust. At that moment, Jeho understood why the elves disliked people so much, and why it was really dangerous for them to be in the Forest of Rocks. But Elda added that there was only one person who was more than an elf or a spirit. He was close to nature, and because of this, all the elves respected him. The boy guessed, which was not difficult, that it was the Shaman Tillet. The elder confirmed his guess and said that the Shaman Tilait had been interacting with the divine tree until the very end. But now this task is Alshia, who absorbed his spirit. The system said that the shaman left the boy a legacy of promises that he could not fulfill. When Alshia became a shaman, the duty to fulfill the promise passed to him. Without the protection of the divine tree, the elves will weaken and disappear, so we need to help them survive by reviving the divine tree, which will be the class cross for Alshia. If successful, the boy will fulfill the promise given to the divine tree and revive it, as well as the home for the elves. If unsuccessful, the tree will die, as will the elves. Jeho was happy to see this quest since he had the 7 divine trees that he had just recently received. Elda added that this seed was entrusted to Alshia as a shaman, and not to ordinary elves. It was the decision of the tree, and they had no right to interfere. But Alshia didn't even know how to grow this tree so that it would actually grow. The elder replied that the fact that the seed was not with them did not mean that the elves would sit quietly with their hands folded and not help their shaman. Then Elda took out a small chain with a pendant in the form of a pink glowing flower. It was a gift for Jeho, thanks to which, no matter what part of the continent he was in, the elves would help him everywhere. This was a legend-class pink clover confirmation necklace. This necklace was made by the village elder of Trian herself. As long as the boy wore it around his neck, the elves would never be hostile to him. Jeho truly regretted having to take off his flower necklace and put it in his inventory, but was happy with Elda's gift, even though it was pink. Taking off his flower necklace, the guy put on a clover chain. The elder laughed and said that Alshia looked as great as I expected. The guy was embarrassed by this compliment, but he knew that his skin tone went well with pink. But because it was the first time he wore such a necklace, the guy was even more embarrassed. And while the elves celebrated the appearance of a new shaman, they were watched from the room of the New World Observation Team. Everyone was amazed that Jeho was able to do it after all. The guys even bet on his defeat, but few expected Jeho to stay in this world for 2 months. Moreover, they did not know that such a quest existed. Here the team leader ordered everyone to stop discussing and talk about the fact that a major event had started from the moment the game opened. This is the first SSS class event, so it's understandable that everyone is eager to tell everyone, but you have to remember that it's forbidden to disclose it. Frightened by the leader's menacing tone, the team members replied that they understood everything and would not tell anyone anything. The leader then added that their job is to observe, and that only the president is responsible for all decisions, so everyone needs to watch their tongues. If all goes well, this will be a great achievement for their observer team. This Alshia found hidden quests in wildflowers that no one had ever seen before, and won through his efforts and perseverance. The manager knew that this guy was a great player, so it was better to just pray for his great future and the future he would create for their team. But Jeho himself was now busy learning more about Elda's new hobby, deciding to ask her one question. He asked if she had made the necklace in a color other than pink, and if so, why didn't she give him a navy blue necklace? But the elder was in no hurry to answer this question, calmly continuing to drink tea. And then she turned around and, leaving, answered in the end that everything is the will of the divine tree. Only the guy realized that it looks like, in this regard, everything is the will of Elda. Soon, after a tiring and cheerful night, a new fresh morning arrived. Jeho got up early and was about to leave when someone called him. It was the elder that Jeho had to answer that he really wanted to stay in Trian village, but he had to take care of the fate of the other elves. Elda thanked the guy and said that they had prepared a small token of gratitude for him, which was in the hands of another elf right behind her. Seeing the gift, Alshia didn't even know how to react. It was a beautifully crafted elven bow and the arrows made for it, of which there were 30 pieces, and there was also an elven rapier. The elder said that Alshia might not be able to use them yet, but she hoped that they would be useful to him in the future. The boy thanked the elder and replied that he would use this gift carefully. All the elves left the village to say goodbye to the shaman. The elder decided to ask him one more request. At the same moment, a system notification showed that the guy had received the title of Elven Idol, since the elves were very sympathetic to Musi. Then he replied that he would do everything possible to restore the Tree of Life. At that moment, members of the Forest Rocky organization were watching them from the bushes and were becoming more and more surprised by what was happening with each passing second. The boy and girl in robes couldn't believe that this man had received a weapon as a gift from the elves, but May said that this was something they didn't expect, and now they could proceed with the plan. The boys then turned to their leader, who replied that there was no more time to watch. Now that suspicious guy has left the village, they can move out. After some time, Jeho was already walking through the dense forest. Since he became a participant in the events, he received a task related to the elves, because of which he even forgot about his dream of a flower shop. Revive the sacred tree, and the foundation of the place for the elves is a difficult task. Does he really have to save the Rizzalan forest that was attacked by demons? Elda said that after the attack, the forest became a haven for demons, and it would take forever to cleanse it. The guy tried to find information, but even the creators of the game on the forum say that it is very difficult there. Then Jeho decided to use his brain to the fullest and think even more carefully. He decided there was only one way, to grow the seeds of the sacred tree in a suitable flower shop together. Here the system showed that the spirit of life responded to his words, saying that it knew a good place to carry out this task. Jeho suddenly remembered that this spirit really did have extensive information about the sacred tree. Then the guy decided to ask him where the best place to plant this tree was, but an awkward silence arose between Jeho and the system notification that the spirit was communicating through. And then, at some point, a notification popped up that the spirit of life seemed to have forgotten where this place was. This statement greatly angered Jeho, who had been hoping for help all this time. But the spirit of life replied that it had been only a short time since he had woken up, so he needed to come to his senses. The boy replied that he understood everything and asked the spirit of life to tell him about this place as soon as he remembered it. Now he needs to make basic preparations for the future. He needs to expand the reference book by studying plants. But then Alshia heard some strange sound from the bushes, and his gaze immediately fell on them. Turning around, the guy saw in front of him a huge brown bear of the 25th level of the rock forest. Naturally, the size and appearance of this animal greatly frightened Jeho, who was afraid to even move. The bear really looked menacing and seemed to be in a less than friendly mood. A few moments later, he jumped out of the bushes straight at Jeho, who managed to jump away from him. What was surprising was that the boy and the bear jumped away from each other at the same time, but Jeho did so because he was surprised. Jeho then noticed that this huge bear was just standing in front of him and was not going to attack. Suddenly, the life dead appeared and said that when wild animals see Alshia's face, they get scared. But the guy replied that it doesn't matter because he doesn't see the bear running away from him. Quite the opposite. The bear's eyes became more and more aggressive and confident, after which he ran up to the guy and decided to hit him with his big paw, but Jeho managed to dodge. His foot slid along the ground, but the boy did not fall. He jumped even further away from the bear and decided to fight him after all. Taking a fighting stance, Alshia said that despite being level 8, he had good enough reaction and speed to fight a bear. The boy remembered that the elf had been able to avoid his fist, but he wasn't sure if the bear could do the same. After which Alshia took out from his inventory the very rapier that the elves had given him. Having raised it above himself, the guy no longer doubted his victory and pounced on the bear. He started to growl loudly at him and was ready to fight. But the clumsy fencing failed the attack, and the brown bear avoided the attack due to Alshia's lack of fencing skills. Moreover, the guy received 98 damage from the brown bear, and due to the strong blow, he received damage to the joint. Thus, Alshia's agility was reduced by 10%. The bailiff put his hand to his sore head, and the boy couldn't believe that everything had turned out so badly. But now he knew that it was useless to attack with a weapon that he couldn't use. Getting to his feet, he began to remember where his rapier had flown. But now it wasn't so important, since he wouldn't be able to use it anyway. Then he rose to his feet and decided to take advantage of what everyone feared about him. His face, which expressed the most menacing emotions that a human face could possibly display. Initially, the bear was not fazed by this and continued to attack the guy. But he had well-developed fighting skills, which allowed him to dodge the bear's slow attacks. By hitting the bear in the belly once, Jeho dealt him 7 points of damage. Then the bear tried to attack again, but the boy dodged again. Then he suddenly stood up and hit the bear from below, causing him 10 points of damage. This only made the bear even more angry, and he was ready to tear the guy to pieces. But he was not ready to give up, and each time he dealt several points of damage with regular punches. But Jeho knew that this damage was too low to defeat the bear. If this continued, he would simply collapse from exhaustion. The guy wondered if there was anything that could increase his attack power, and then an idea came to his mind. He looked at his inventory again, deciding to use something from it. All this time, May and her comrades were watching this hellish battle, and they were shocked that the guy was fighting a bear with his bare hands. May offered to help him, but the leader replied that this was all he was waiting for. No matter what kind of weapon the guy got from the elf hotel, with his low level 8, he wouldn't be able to use it. Moreover, with such a level, it is simply unrealistic to survive in the forest of the rock, so they will attack him after the battle with the bear when he is exhausted and take away the weapons of the elves. May tried to object, as she felt sorry for Jeho, but her leader pounced on the girl and shouted that her mind must be clear and firm for the sake of their common future. But May replied that it would be better for them to get closer to this guy now, which could help them a lot more later. After all, he is an ordinary innocent man who even talks to flowers and plays the flute for them. May's friends were surprised by this information, but they were suddenly distracted by what was happening in the clearing. May, like the others, heard a very strange sound. Jeho took out the very same divine tree seed from his inventory, with which he was able to deal 105 points of damage to the brown bear, which even the spirit of life was shocked by. Jeho turned into a perfect weapon that deals perfect damage, but the spirit of life was frightened by the boy's disrespectful act. Looking at the aggressive Jeho attacking the bear, May still couldn't decide for herself whether he was a man, a monster, or a demon. Moreover, all members of this company understood that their plan would definitely fail if they attacked Jeho. The guy in the robe immediately began to pretend that he had forgotten to watch the 9 o'clock news, so it was time for him to go. Surprisingly, the chief hesitated and said that if it was so important to the guy, then nothing could be done, and they would all have to go, because the news was very important. Looking at this whole circus, May thought. At this time, the head turned to the girl and suggested that she postpone their plan today until a more favorable day. But she stood silently and did not answer. She then told them to go back without her, as she wanted to keep an eye on the guy some more. No matter how much she looked at him, she could not understand what he was really like, but the only thing she could trust was her eyes, which failed her every time when it came to Jeho. Eventually, the guy managed to kill the brown bear Rakshi, which allowed him to level up. He also received 11 pieces of bear meat, the gallbladder of this bear, and 6 of its claws. After that, Jeho got the title of a cruel seed killer, increased the damage of attacks using plants, and also the title of killer with bare hands, which increased his strength by 1. These titles seemed very strange to the guy. So he decided that he needed to pay more attention to the distribution of stats. Even though he was in the game, he was very tired after just one fight. It was hard to imagine what would happen to him if there was a whole series of such fights. However, Alshia had reached level 10 of the Shaman class. His strength was now 42, intelligence was 9, agility was 30, health was 21, and mana was 12. His unused stat points were 8, and his attacks ranged from 16 to 24. The guy at that moment thought that his fatigue directly depended on his health, as Vancic said. Before that, Jeho invested stats in strength and agility. Now it was worth choosing health on Vancic's advice. After that, Jeho thought that this was a really great idea and that he seemed to have already adapted to these possibilities. But then he noticed something strange, namely another movement in the bushes, thinking that it was another bear. Carrying a tree seed with him, Jeho dashed towards the bushes to chase away the bear before it attacked him. But then the guy stopped abruptly because there was no bear in the bushes at all. It was a girl who covered her head with her hands out of fear and asked not to hit her. She started apologizing for everything and was constantly recorded. It was that same May who, realizing that no one was bothering her, opened one eye. At the bottom stood a huge sullen guy with a questioning, if you could call him that, expression on his face. The girl was horrified and once again, like a wound-up record, began to ask him not to hit her, and then again apologized for scaring him. Jeho didn't say a word, just looked at the frightened girl. She closed her eyes, trying to pull herself together and be more natural. Then she suddenly opened her eyes and, giggling and stuttering, asked the guy if he had started the game in the Forest of Rocks just like she had. Jeho stared at the girl with an even more surprised look, not understanding what she wanted from him. May felt incredibly awkward to continue this conversation, since the answer to her question was obvious. Then she decided to ask another question, the answer to which would not be so predictable, so she asked how the guy was feeling in the forest. This question left Jeho completely confused and completely lost the logical chain of their conversation. May was simply burning with shame inside, being sure that this jock definitely thought she was crazy. So she decided to get straight to the point and asked if the guy was going to leave the Forest of Rocks, and if so, she would like to go with him. Jeho was still confused as he looked at the girl's country. She closed her eyes again, thinking that now she had definitely screwed up, since she had rushed and blurted it out faster than she should have. But then she heard one word that surprised her very much. The huge guy said to her, "Good," which meant that he agreed to take her with him. Jeho then added that the monsters in this forest were abnormal, and fighting together was better than fighting alone. After that, the guy opened his inventory to get something out of there. He took the crafted elven bow and 30 arrows, and then handed them to the girl, saying that he couldn't use it anyway, and he was used to relying only on his hand-to-hand combat skills. May was very surprised by this act, not believing that she could simply accept it. Then Jeho said that if the girl couldn't decide for so long, then a slap on the back of the head would definitely help her. Coming from the guy's mouth, it sounded too threatening. But his face looked even more menacing when he said he was joking. May forced out a laugh and then thanked Jeho for such a gift, thinking to herself that it didn't really seem like a joke, since this guy looked like he could get anyone even from hell. But then Jae-ho seemed to remember something and added that he forgot to check something. May looked at him questioningly, not understanding what he was talking about. Jae-ho said that he would stay in the forest of rocks for a while longer, and he wasn't sure if that would suit the girl. But May, without even thinking, said that she would agree to stay with him in the forest for a couple of days. Jae-ho then turned to the girl and said that, in that case, he was looking forward to their work together. After this moment, 4 hours passed, and all this time the guy studied flowers that grow only in wetlands, and their main food was microorganisms in the soil. The fungal flower, parasitizing with the help of roots, had no taste, so it was useless to eat it. Listening to Jae-ho's conclusions, May just stood aside and thought, why is he studying the types of plants and flowers and muttering something under his breath? It's hard to believe that this is the one who defeated an opponent who was stronger than him. It looked too strange and contradictory for the girl. She thought the monster was just an image so that he wouldn't be disturbed while studying the flowers, but what she saw before was a delusion. Jae-ho, meanwhile, was thinking about what was wrong with this girl and why she was looking at him, as if she was drilling a hole in him with her gaze. And then an interesting thought came into his head, which made him very happy. He smiled, because he thought that his thoughts about his face, which he considered above average in beauty, were actually true, since girls were looking at it so much. But May was only thinking about the guy's strange laugh. It was too strange but quite curious for her, which she herself could not explain. After some time, the guy stood up and said that he was going to leave the game. Then May asked when they could meet next. Jae-ho replied that he would be in the game tomorrow at around 3 p.m. May decided to clarify what time he was reporting on. Jae-ho replied that he was on Korean time, remembering that the game had an automatic language translator built in, so this time, the girl really asked an important question. After hearing the guy's answer, she got excited and said that she was also from Korea, but then an awkward silence arose between them. The girl was the first to decide to interrupt him and said goodbye to Jae-ho, saying that she would return to the game at that time, and the guy said rather coldly that they would see each other again. May was about to leave but suddenly remembered something and stopped, deciding to ask Jae-ho one question. The girl was curious about the name of this huge, muscular guy, so she introduced herself and asked his name. Turning his head, Hwang Jae-ho wanted to introduce himself with his real name, but then he remembered that he was in a game, so he said that he was Alshia. The guy's gaze again seemed too threatening and scary to May, which made her stagger a little. Smiling, the girl replied that it was simply a beautiful name, but Jae-ho was bothered by the long pause she made in her answer. Thus, the guys parted for a while, after which Jae-ho headed to the Urim Hall. As soon as he entered there, he immediately began to listen to curses addressed to him by his father about the fact that he was 5 minutes late. Jae-ho's father, who also owned the Urim Hall, was simply furious when he found out that his son was playing this game, and he, listening to the loud screams, wondered who had betrayed him. The father shouted that he was not stopping his son from playing, as he himself had played when he was young, but that the game was too strange, because in order to play it, you had to lie in a capsule and not use a keyboard and mouse, which contributed to the loss of muscle mass. But Jae-ho was able to interrupt his father with just a quiet appeal to him. The boy raised his head and told his father not to worry, because he wanted him to become a martial artist. Anyway, in reality, his mother is against it, but what about the virtual world? These words angered the father, who shouted that his son was going too far. But Jae-ho explained that the new world was played by a third of the world's population, and although it was different from his father's desire for martial arts, if he aimed for first place, it was the same as challenging the champions. So the boy did not start playing the game. The father's gaze became too contradictory to say exactly what emotion he was currently experiencing, but Jae-ho looked confidently into his father's eyes and addressed him again. But his father simply turned his back to the guy and said nothing. But then he suddenly quietly asked his son if he wanted to be a champion in reality or to become a king from this game. Jae-ho replied that these were identical concepts and that he really wanted it. Then the father turned to him and asked what in that case his son's profession was in this game. The boy lowered his eyes and replied that, of course, his profession is a warrior, and it can't be any other way. Hearing this, the father almost burst into tears from pride for his son. He couldn't believe that his son thought so much about him, but Jae-ho only thought that if his father found out about the creation of a flower shop in the game, then he would definitely not survive. Eventually, father and son began training, while a stranger entered the forest of rocks, wanting to be in this famous forest that everyone talks about. He just wanted to gather newcomers into the locomotive behind him, to bring them out, and it would be easy money. After all, too often newbies wrote on the forum that they had started playing in the Forest of Rocks in vain and asked for help. Although the monsters here were no more than level 50 or so, for some reason this forest had a bad reputation, even though it was very easy to get here. So a sunset knight named Worcester from the Prime Guild got to him, who was at level 134 of a rare class. He received the title Lively due to reaching level 100 without dying. His defense in battle was increased by 40%, but after the first death, he could lose the title. Having gone a little deeper into the forest, the knight saw one of those very elves for whom the Forest of Rocks was so famous, and called out to him. Worcester then asked about a certain Jonas, and asked to bring him, as he had come for this guy. The elf looked questioningly at the knight and replied that he would simply ignore it, since they had recently had a celebration, so let the guy just leave while the elf was kind. Worcester was shocked by such impudence, and at first he couldn't even say anything. But the next second he laughed very hard and I covered my eyes with my hands. This laughter was not so much sincere as threatening. And then Worcester added that if this elf does not want to go to the next world, then let him bring Jonas here. The elf didn't even react to the knight taking out his sharp sword and pointing it at him. He was simply placed on the tip of a sword that was not really there, and which seemed to have been cut off by someone. It seemed strange and harmless enough, but the elf immediately understood what was going on. But unfortunately, he had to deal with this situation on his own, as Alshia entered the new world only the next day. The guy thought about how he almost quit the game because of his father's scolding, but it's good that everything worked out. Then Alshia heard strange sounds from behind and decided to turn around to see who was making them. It was May, who was looking at the guy happily, as she didn't even believe that he would log into the game at this time. She looked like she had been standing there for a long time. She said that she had just entered the game, as did Alshia, who decided not to argue with her. In any case, he suggested that the girl work well together today, to which she readily agreed. Then she turned to Alchia-nim and asked him to take care of her too. Hearing the girl pronounce the name like that, Jeho realized that the name didn't suit him at all. However, there was no time to think about this, and the boys went to the clearing, where, as expected, there were many flowers. Jeho discovered new flowers and added them to the botanical reference book, which was already 50% filled. Thus, the interest of the elves of the Rockshi forest towards the guy increased, as well as the buff to study flowers. All this time, May looked in surprise at the guy who had been silently watching the plants for the second day, but this made her even more curious to watch him. And then one question ripened in her head. She cleared her throat, drawing Alshia's attention. Then the girl asked when the guy started playing the new world. This question surprised him very much, since he himself did not see any useful information in it for the girl herself. Then May explained that usually people are busy leveling up right after the start, but Alshia-nim had probably been playing this game for quite a long time. However, all this time he was just looking at the flowers, so May decided to ask the guy if he really liked them so much. Jeho's face became too worried and became more and more frightening with each passing second. Seeing his expression, May said, frightened and stuttering, that if Alshia was uncomfortable, then he didn't have to answer questions on this topic. The guy got up from his knees, distracted from the flowers, and said that he was ready to answer. This behavior greatly surprised the girl, who did not even have time to understand what was happening. The next moment, Alshia grabbed May by the shoulders with his powerful hands, and she thought with fear that her question was too unpleasant for the guy, since he was doing this. His face was too threatening and scary, but he really started talking about flowers, looking intently at May, who thought that she would get into trouble for her questions. But the guy only sincerely said that he really liked flowers and he dreamed of opening his own flower shop. Hearing these words, spoken with such sincere naivety, the girl did not know what to answer, but Alshia added that in addition to this, he would like to plant a large garden. But in reality, the circumstances are completely different, so as a replacement, he decided to open a store at least in the game. May thought about these words, which did not match the guy's appearance at all, and especially did not match his cute name, which, although it was a nickname, still did not suit his face at all. But one thing still remained a mystery to May, namely, why did the elves react so well to Alshia? Nima? Most likely his sincerity greatly touched the elves. If she learns this ability from Alshia-nim, she too will be able to get along with the elves. These thoughts captured the girl so much that she looked up with delight, her eyes shining with joy. But Alshia looked at her all this time with his emotionless gaze and thought that this girl was too strange. But then a strange rustling sound was heard in the bushes, attracting the attention of both friends. May didn't understand what these sounds were, but it was clear that something was happening nearby. Alshia was silent and stared in the direction of the source of the sound. And then I asked myself, should they check what was going on there? But these were not just sounds, because from them one could understand that somewhere nearby someone was very scared. That same sunset knight named Worcester was running away from something strange that scared him very much. The guy couldn't even imagine that elves were so strong. Moreover, he understood that this could be his last battle, which he didn't want at all. While Worcester was running wherever his eyes looked, just to get away from the elves, one of them caught up with him. And then, with eyes burning with anger, he asked this little knight where he was running away to, because they needed to find Jonas. Frightened, Worcester stopped and put his shield in front of him, blocking himself from the elf. But this did not stop the elf, and he hit the shield with his fist, period. It sent out a shockwave that was too strong, throwing both guys away from each other. Worcester couldn't believe that such power could be in a punch, but then someone grabbed his shield from the other side. It was the same elf who said that this shield was quite good. The knight immediately pulled his shield to the side, revealing his body and face distorted with fear. Then the elf said that despite the wonderful shield, the man who uses it does not live up to the expectations of his weapon. Smiling kindly, the elf added that all this was only because this man was too weak. Then the smile fell from his face and his gaze became impenetrable and emotionless, after which the elf also without emotion struck Wooster, from which he bent in half. It seemed like a normal knee strike, but its force exceeded all expectations. The guy bent down in front of the elf, who also continued to calmly look at him. But, nevertheless, Wooster remained standing on his feet, which even surprised the elf a little. Wooster thought that this blow had taken away most of his XP, and if he couldn't run away, he needed to drink a potion right now, and then he needed to concentrate for 3 seconds to use a skill that ate up all his mana. Using this ability would take the last of the knight's strength, but he was sure that if he failed concentration, there would be no more chance. But the elf, seeing that Wooster had stepped on the flower, tried to stop him. But the knight shouted that it was too late as the elf dared to look down on the sunset night. After that, he began to activate his Twilight Wall skill. But before he could finish speaking, he fell silent when someone's huge hand fell on his shoulder. Since the cast of the Twilight Wall was cancelled, this skill burned all the mana of the knight, who was now completely defenseless. He decided to look with horror at the one who had decided his last chance to win. Looking at the huge guy from behind, Wooster called him scary with a wild look, not believing that he dared to stop him. But Alshia looked only at the flower that had just been trampled. And then, looking at the knight with a look full of anger, he asked if he saw what he had done. Seeing such an expression on Alshia's face, Wooster did not even dare to move, let alone answer. Wooster stuttered, trying to figure out who was in front of him. After all, the guy clearly didn't look like an elf. The big guy's ears were completely normal, and his clothes were like those of a newbie. But Wooster wasn't sure if this was the face of a real person. This face, full of anger, looked more like the face of the devil himself or a terrible monster. Then Alshia said mockingly that this guy's action was too bold. After all, it was he who trampled all the flowers in the area and remained unpunished? Wooster was shocked to hear such a strange claim, because he had not even thought about it. Pushing Alshia away from himself and taking out a sword from his inventory, the knight said that this newbie was definitely crazy. Wooster then raised his sword above his head and swung it at Alsh, who in turn didn't even flinch. Then the guy sharply dodged the blow, closing his fist on the knight. The blow landed right on Wooster's face, who certainly didn't expect it to be so strong. He completely disoriented the knight, who was unable to even respond. But this was not the last blow from Alshia, who continued to punish his enemy for his tactless attitude towards nature. Blow after blow, the enemy became weaker and weaker. Alshia, however, seemed not to show any emotion and managed to land 4 blows. Wooster's system showed that this newcomer had only dealt him 4 points of damage, meaning his blows weren't that scary for him. Wooster said that Alshia's attacks are useless to him, since he doesn't even feel them, so let this strange guy move away and not bother him anymore. The next second, Wooster swung at Alshia again, but somehow very deftly and quickly dodged the blow. The knight knew he could destroy this huge guy with 1 blow, but he still couldn't hit him. He was even more exhausted trying to prove his theory to himself. Finally, he pushed off the ground and jumped right above Alshia, raising his sword above himself. Wooster was sure that he would get to this guy now and destroy him. But his blows seemed too slow, and Alshia managed to dodge each time. This began to anger the knight more and more, and his attacks became more frequent. But while he was attacking, his mana, burned by the skill, was slowly being replenished, and this was an opportunity to use another skill that would definitely be able to defeat the enemy. During his attacks, Wooster cut the flowers with his sword, which further angered Alshia, who was outraged by such behavior of the stranger. With each passing second, he became more and more furious, and was now sure that this impudent guy would not receive forgiveness from him. And then he stood in a fighting stance opposite the knight, creating a maddening, threatening look. Wooster was very surprised by the boy's speed and agility, as he was too large in frame for these skills. He didn't even have time to notice how Alshia's fist flew towards him. And then another and another, increasingly increasing the speed and frequency of the blows. Wooster couldn't believe he was getting hit by some newbie, but he only had hope in his mana, which had almost recovered. In the end, he took all his anger into his fist and attacked Alshia, being sure that now his end would come. He started to activate his skill, but again did not have time to use it. There was a deafening bang behind Wooster. The boy's pupils narrowed from a lack of understanding of what was happening and a feeling of fear. Alshia was no less surprised by his friend's help. The elf who had dealt Wooster a strong blow before asked if Alshia Nim was okay. Wooster was very surprised by the elf's concern for the human. But suddenly the knight felt his armor being destroyed, and what's more, he couldn't even move. The system showed that the sudden blow had caused Wooster to faint abnormally. He couldn't believe that he was left motionless in front of Alshia, who was now finding it too easy to hit him. And the guy did this too quickly, completely discouraging the frightened knight. His punches were so professional and fast that it was easy to guess that he was a real athlete. Alshia used a famous boxing technique, the Sun Dempsey. This is a combined counterattack in response to an opponent's side punch, which consists of a dive under the punching hand, a feint to the outside, and a side punch to the head. Finally, Alshia took out the 7 tree and swung it at the guy. His fists were already burning from the tension, so the guy decided to use his strange but effective weapon. In this way, he wanted to wait until his fists cooled down, but at the same time he continued to strike with his seed. The spirit of life still made attempts to prevent the seed from being used as a weapon, but at this point it had become the most effective way to eliminate the villain Worcester. He couldn't move and was already asking the guy to stop, as he couldn't withstand such blows. But Alshia was determined, because he remembered what the knight had done. Finally, he dealt him the most crushing blow of all. Worcester couldn't take it anymore and fell to the ground. His destruction lowered him to level 1, and as a penalty, he lost his Twilight Barrage shield. The system warned that the connection would be broken in 10 minutes, and that it could be restored at the checkpoint in 10 hours. Well, this was no longer a problem for Alshia, who towered over his defeated opponent. The victory over the knight increased the system's level and fame for Alshia, and for removing the title of the Lively One from the enemy, the guy received the title of the Honorable Destroyer, given for additional damage against players with a high or bad reputation. May was too surprised by Alshia's action, who destroyed the enemy for trampling and cutting flowers, but she was not frightened by this, and she pointed to the knight's shield lying nearby. The sword's strength was 280 points, and its defense was 320. If the Twilight Synergy was used, the defense would increase to 500. It was the shield of the Twilight Knights, who were closely watching the end of the ancient Holy Empire of Gracia. The sealed spirit of the Twilight Knights was dormant, but the shield could form a twilight wall that would awaken the will of the Twilight Knights for 5 seconds to stop the enemies. This little thing was very much liked by both May and Alshia. Suddenly, the elf, who had been nearby all this time, turned to the already familiar Alshia and thanked him for protecting the flowers. May was still in shock from the boy's close contact with the elves. The elf explained that this knight had arrived in the village of Treon and had started behaving unceremoniously. Since he had become a threat to the elves and was a danger to others, he had set off in pursuit. Then Alshia smiled and replied that in that case, this knight really deserved what he got, but he was sure of it back when Worcester stepped on the flowers. The elf looked at the guy again with gratitude and said that this was an answer worthy of a shaman. But then he noticed a strange girl standing next to Alshia. Her eyes were shining with delight, and the elf did not understand what kind of look this was and who this strange character was. Alshia replied that the girl was helping him with his study of flowers, but at the moment, May was beaming with delight at the fact that the elf was looking at her. The elf said that it was expected of Alshia to find an assistant. He had already heard that Till had always had assistants. Alshia was about to object, but the elf turned to May and wished her good cooperation with the shaman Alshia. The system immediately showed that the elves showed very little curiosity about May. She was again embarrassed by the elf's interest in her and thanked him. Then the elf said goodbye to the boys and told them to visit the village more often. Alshia thanked the elf as he said goodbye, and then thought that he had had enough for today and it was time to return home. But then he heard a girl's weak voice addressing him. Alshia turned around and saw May's delighted eyes as she asked if she could really become his assistant. The guy was a little surprised by this statement, not expecting such excitement and initiative from the girl. He asked again what she meant, as it was a very strange proposal. But May understood that she couldn't miss the chance to get closer to the elves, so she really wanted to become Alshia's assistant. The girl's assertiveness even scared Jeho a little, and he was a little taken aback. But then he relaxed and thought that an assistant wouldn't bother him, so if May wanted it that way, then let her be his assistant. The girl was very happy, but then she was distracted by a system notification. As soon as she became an assistant, the system offered her many quests. A quest to change her profession to a shaman's assistant, the conditions for success of which are receiving direct permission from the shaman. If she agreed, she would be completely owned by the shaman. But May was not embarrassed and decided to change her profession to assistant. But having done this, she did not feel any changes. But now it didn't matter, because now the elves would finally start paying attention to her. From the joyful feelings, May giggled slyly and contentedly, which greatly confused Alshia, who did not understand why the girl was behaving so strangely for the umpteenth time. He thought that when they got out of the forest, he should go his separate ways with her. Well, suddenly he saw something interesting, as a new system notification popped up in front of him. She reported that the player May had been appointed as the shaman's assistant, and now the boy could summon the character wherever he was. Now, Alshia not only owned a botanical reference book, but also a shaman's assistant named May. The word own and the ability to call the girl at any time greatly confused the guy. Then he decided to try to summon an assistant using the system, even though she was nearby. As soon as he pressed the button, May appeared even closer right in front of him, with a surprised face in the air. But it didn't last long, because after a few seconds she simply fell to the ground. Alshia blamed herself that such consequences should have been guessed without checking, and May only realized that this happened because she became the shaman's assistant. Then she finally decided to ask what Alshia's profession was. This question surprised the guy very much, since the girl agreed to change her profession, knowing absolutely nothing about it. May said that she changed it just like that, but now she is very interested in who is a shaman. who suggested that Alshia was not a newbie at all, and if so, that would explain his skill in combat. The guy looked closely at the girl and thought about how best to explain it to her. In theory, he didn't have to share information about his difficult task with anyone, so he simply replied that the shaman class was given to those who wanted to open a flower shop. This information did not greatly surprise the girl, who rose to her feet and began to brush the dust off her clothes. But then she looked at the guy and happily said that now they could move on to informal communication. Alshia didn't understand what the girl meant. May replied that since she became the guy's assistant, they could now communicate as friends. Alshia, in general, agreed to this, but in reality, May simply felt uncomfortable addressing the interlocutor as an adult and respected person. And while May and Alshia were resolving small misunderstandings between themselves, Wooster managed to recover, but he lost his shield and the status of a lively one, and his level dropped significantly. There were 5 minutes left before the forced shutdown. After this time, Wooster will be reconnected to the server and respawn at the checkpoint, and before the forced disconnection, the character will go to a safe non-game space. This greatly angered the guy, who decided to contact his leader, the player Bamboo Cane, and tell him about the situation. Wooster started calling out to his leader and telling him that he screwed up. Bamboo Cane is the leader of the Prime Guild, and he is now answering Wooster's request for a private conversation. The male voice immediately began to inquire what had happened to the knight and why he had called so suddenly, but he only hesitated awkwardly and did not know how best to speak about his failure. When the guy finally decided to tell everything, he heard silence in response. Guildmaster Prime Level 274 replied that he had warned not to go into that forest, since even better players do not go there. But Wooster said that he died not at the hands of an elf, but at the hands of a player, which greatly surprised the leader. Then he said that there are so-called capable players, a real thorn in everyone's side. Wooster had never died before today's skirmish, so he failed, because he simply lacked experience. The entire guild was waiting for Wooster to upgrade from rare to unique, but without the twilight barrier that he had lost, it would be impossible. Then the leader decided to ask if the knight remembered this mysterious player, especially his face. Wooster replied that the guy looked really scary and was probably high level. Hearing this, the leader told the guy to try to rest when he disconnected from the server. And he himself will go in search of that poor guy from the forum, because if a pumped-up player went to the Rockchi Forest, nothing would happen to him. There is a desert right next to the location, where one of the members of their guild is doing a quest, so he can be attracted. There were 8 seconds left before Wooster switched off, and after saying goodbye to the leader, the guy spent the rest of the time thinking that he would never forget what happened to him today. He couldn't understand how he could let his guard down and be like a newbie who couldn't see what was going on behind his back. Wooster would never forget this fool, no matter how, but when he returns, he will definitely take revenge. But now we must wait for the time of revival, after the end of which, the server world would again open the doors for the character Wooster. And while the unlucky knight was thinking up a plan for revenge, at that very moment Jeho just came out of the new world. He found himself at home, in one of the apartments of a large multi-story building. He went into the kitchen and met his father, with whom they began to eat in silence. Then the father decided to break the silence and turn to his wary son, asking him how he was doing and when he would become the king of his game. Jeho hesitated, not knowing what to say to this. Then the father asked, "Isn't it wonderful to be a hand-to-hand combat warrior? And won't the boy get sick if he plays a lot? After all, you need to take care of your health, so today he can skip cleaning the hall and just do leg exercises." Jeho didn't understand how many types of hand-to-hand combat they still wanted to teach him, so he decided to turn to his father to tell him something. Well, his father interrupted him, saying that his son was so fired up by his new hobby, and he, as an old man, couldn't even help in any way, so he bought him something that is now in Jeho's room. Entering the room, the father presented his gift, a second-hand game capsule. It didn't look super reliable, but it was still very nice. But Jeho asked excitedly, had they already paid off the gym loan to afford something like this? The father replied that it wasn't that expensive, but since his son was going to be a world champion, why not buy it? Then Jeho asked the second question, but in a more excited voice, namely, does mom know about this thing? The father did not utter a word, and his face was frozen in a single grimace, from which one could understand that the unforeseen expenses had not been discussed with his wife. Then the father looked at Jeho and said that he just hoped that his mother would understand him correctly when she came home. But that didn't happen, as this formidable woman named Yoonhee started yelling at this thoughtless act. She screamed that they would not repay the loan if the man continued to take the last money from their pocket. And no matter how the father tried to justify himself, even bringing in his son, his wife became more and more angry. During another attempt to justify himself, the man saw the door behind him open slightly. It was Jeho, who was secretly watching the scandal. Seeing his son, the father called him in the hope of salvation, and that he would not be offended, since most likely, he heard how the father tried to shift all the blame onto him. Jeho looked at his father with an impenetrable and emotionless, eerie gaze. A second later, the door slammed shut, and the person standing behind it did not deign to come to the rescue. This both angered and frightened Jaeho's father, who had to figure it out on his own. Walking away from the door from which the sounds of the scandal were coming, Jaeho smiled happily and understood that he would never forget his father's sacrifice like that. Now the guy understood that his dream was a priority, and no one should know about it. These thoughts inspired him greatly, and he wanted to go towards his goal even more. After all, he could now appear in the new world much more often, which he did, and eventually his botanical reference book in the section on the flowers of the Forest of the Rocks was 95% filled. The guy thoughtfully thought about those missing 5%, since he had already studied most of the flowers growing here. However, he could not find the remaining one. It is, of course, logical that rare ones cannot be found quickly, but still it is very strange. May said thoughtfully that they had visited almost every corner of this forest in the last few days. Jaeho noted that the location here was not that big, but there was one thing. May asked the guy with interest what he meant, and he replied that there was still one spot left. May was surprised, since they no longer had any unexplored territories on the map. Then she asked the question, where could that very interesting place be? Jaeho then pointed to a huge rocky mountain that looked too dangerous to climb, but the boy didn't want to stop. At first, May thought Alshia was joking, since there was an ordinary rocky peak in that direction, so there would hardly be any vegetation on it. But Jaeho was sure that they still needed to check. He couldn't refuse to explore the area just because at first glance it was without flowers, but the guy warned that he would go alone, since May's stamina stat was very low. The girl breathed a sigh of relief and said that then she would stay here and watch the percentage. Jaeho was not against her decision and decided to find some climbing equipment. He remembered that the elves might have such things, so he said that he would now go straight to them. Hearing this, May immediately turned around and grabbed the guy by the sleeve, stopping him. He looked questioningly at the girl's strange actions, and she asked why Alshia, or rather the shaman, wouldn't trust such a trifle to his assistant. The girl was ready to do anything to get to the elves. Thus the boy finally got hold of the climbing equipment, and the well-made elven ice axe was already resting against the ice of the cliff. This enchanted ice axe was designed to climb steep cliffs and was blessed by the elves. The guy climbed up, which turned out to be quite a difficult task, but the tools given by the elves turned out to be very useful. Harness, ropes, rock hooks, ice axe, and the rest clearly contributed to the fulfillment of his wish. Jaeho had no intention of stopping and climbed higher and higher. In the end, he had very little left to do, as he had almost reached the top of the cliff. And finally, his hand was able to reach the final ledge. He stretched and threw his leg over the ledge, pulling his entire body up with him. After climbing up and standing on his feet, Jaeho realized that these actions had the same effect as a tough strength training, so he could add this to his exercise routine. Having caught his breath, the guy raised his head and began to look for plants with his eyes. But all around there was solid rock and not a single flower. At that moment, May called him and asked if the guy had found anything, to which he replied in the negative. Then the girl asked in an upset voice what they should do. The guy suggested that they needed to take a good look around first. So now he was going down the other side of the mountain. May shouted that it was very dangerous because going down was completely different from going up. But Jaeho was more attracted by the fact that he could see the whole slope. Then the boy came to a steep slope and said it was time to go. The girl wished him luck and told him to be careful. After 3 hours, the system showed that Alshia's fatigue had reached 90%, so the character needed to rest, as he had already received a state of lethargy. It's a painful condition characterized by slowness, lethargy, and fatigue. But Alshia himself was shocked that he had been descending for 3 hours already. Suddenly, a new notification from the Spirit of Life popped up, strongly recommending that the guy take a rest. Due to everyone's pressure on him, Alshia finally agreed to take a little break. Then he drove the icebreaker into the rock for the last time and fixed his position. Looking down, the guy realized that he was almost down. But suddenly his icebreaker slipped off the rock, meaning Alshia had lost his footing. Naturally, because of this, the guy began to fly down sharply. He tried not to panic, remembering where he had put the other hooks. Under the guy's weight made the rope stretch too tight. Because of this, the rock hook came loose, and then the second and third hook did the same. They couldn't support the weight of the guy who kept falling down. The worst thing was that even the rope broke. It was only a little while before the cable would break completely. Jaeho screamed and couldn't understand what to do next. He continued to fall and scream, realizing that he had no more options. But at that moment, he suddenly earned an achievement that sounded like this. Have wings to fall? It reduced the damage from falling. Unlocked right after that was jump or be dropped. This achievement increased all player stats during the fall, but it didn't help the guy survive. Eventually, he found himself in total darkness, receiving a penalty of being reduced to level 1. But when he opened his eyes, he realized that he was definitely not in this world. But suddenly he saw a notification from the system, which said that Alshia had discovered the Tillet space, which was a hidden location. The guy didn't understand what kind of place this was and why he didn't die, but what interested him most was the question, what kind of strange plant was in front of him? The system responded that it was a sealed spirit containing pure spiritual essence that was sealed by the shaman Tilait in the last moments of his life. The system also warned that players who had received the recognition of the spirits would be allowed to seal. Jaeho was surprised, as he had only seen this seal on the Eifelchi flower before, but he wondered why the flower was so huge. It seemed like it would take years to talk to him, but the system said that now the botanical reference book was 100% complete. The guy had received the achievement of a botanical veteran. Now he had the opportunity to study the plants in more detail, and then it dawned on Jaeho that he had the opportunity to see this flower only because he died, which meant that his death was very fortunate. Coming closer to the flower, the guy decided to examine it and realized that it was a truly powerful plant. He was about to use his plant study skill when he realized that, according to the forest spirit, he was emitting a natural scent and the scent of elves. It was as if the scent was a part of the Shaman Tilayat. After reading all these notifications, the huge bud in front of the guy instantly opened. The flower was emitting too bright a light, but the guy felt that there was something inside it. It turned out that there was a whole separate world inside the flower, a new location called the World of Flower Spirits Boria. For finding it, Alshia's reputation increased even more, and he received the achievement of the Favorite of Spirits, which meant that now all spirits love him. A multitude of glowing balls appeared around him, which Alshia assumed were spirits. After that, the system showed the guy a new class quest. Boria is a world of flower spirits. Honor existence is possible near the sacred tree. After the demon attack, Tillet sealed and safely hid Boria. He promised to remove the seal when the divine tree bloomed again, but as the shaman's successor, it was now Alshia's responsibility to ensure that the world of Boria would bloom luxuriantly once again. If the guy fails, it will mean the death of the divine tree. The two class assignments were very scary for the boy, but he was glad that they were related to flowers. But as soon as Alshia realized everything, he noticed that the bud in front of him began to quickly close. At that moment, his inventory was supplemented with 15 spirit plant seeds, for which the guy received the essence of Boria, but how to use them was not specified, as well as the conditions for their use. Alshia assumed that these were items. He decided that it was not worth touching the sealed spirit for now, and was about to leave. He knew that the system had to take him back, and while he waited for this, he thought about many hidden moments of the new world. Eventually, the boy was resurrected in his control point, the rock forest in Tryan village, and was disconnected from Tilayat's space, after which the system reconnected the player Alshia to the server of the new world. The character was revived at the checkpoint and was in the village of Tryan. It so happened that Alshia appeared right next to the surprised May, who definitely did not expect to see him. There was a note that it was a composite video, but the fact that the witch's hideout had been cleaned up was an undeniable fact. Alshia calmly replied that he died when he fell off a cliff. The girl couldn't believe it, because the guy was standing right in front of her. She asked if it hurt since he looked like he didn't have a single broken bone. Then Alshia sat down and told Darina everything that had happened to him, namely how he had ended up in a hidden location, having found a sealed spirit. May digested this information for a long time, as she could not believe that there was a real spiritual entity somewhere. Then she seemed to start acting up and saying that she would really like such beautiful creatures as elves and spirits to live not only in the fantasy world, but also in life. This was her true dream, and for now, an unfulfilled desire. Having heard the word desire from the girl, Alshia interpreted it in his own way. But he definitely didn't want to think about it, so he hit his knee, deciding to get up. Then the guy said that one of the sections in the botanical reference book was completely filled, so he didn't see any point in staying here for long anymore. So it was time for them to move out. May looked at her partner in surprise, still trying to process what he had said. The girl did not want to leave the forest of rocks at all, but Alshia was adamant and wanted to go further. May was annoyed because the elves had only just begun to pay attention to her, and she had even managed to get a bow made by them. Her eyes were full of annoyance and pity, which did not escape Alshia's notice. But at the same time, the girl understood that she definitely did not want to stop there. If she follows Shaman Alshia now, then we can say with confidence that she will be able to achieve much more. For example, someday she might start flirting with elves. She imagined all those awkward moments she saw in movies. Eventually, she would be able to marry an elf, have 5 children, and even a cat. Such were her dreams. Thinking about this, May began to giggle nervously again, and Alshia again wondered what was happening to her again. And while the friends were deciding this issue, 2 knights appeared at the entrance to the thicket of the Forest of Rocks. It was the same Worcester with his leader, who said that he had just finished watching, and so far no one had gone beyond the location. There's a good chance that the guy who beat Worcester is a professional PvP player. A place like the Rock Forest is perfect for their idea, as it's very quiet, but you still need to be prepared. Turning nervously towards the strange sound, Worcester hoped that it was not elves but people moving towards them right now. The knight's guess turned out to be correct, as in the depths of the forest they noticed a huge figure of a guy and a small girl next to him. It became clear that they wanted to cross the forest border, so the knights should get ready. The guild leader thrust his spear forward, straight towards the people coming towards them. But then both knights were a little taken aback, noticing Alshia. Even the bamboo cane was frightened by his impressive appearance. Here Worcester said that in the fight with him, he had lost his shield. Then both knights took up fighting stances in front of Alshia, who was advancing towards them, and behind him there seemed to be a thick and dark aura. The guy's gaze was enough to plunge his opponents into fear. Both knights were suddenly embarrassed, not even daring to move while those eyes were looking at them. Alshia came closer and closer to them, but the guild leader did nothing, remaining standing aside in fear. But what was his surprise when Alshia simply walked past and went on his way? Bamboo Cane was surprised at how this guy was able to create such an oppressive atmosphere with just his presence, not to mention his face and the aura of absolute strength emanating from him. It felt like there was a real ferocious predator in front of the guy. He is a conventional tiger with huge fangs, who, if he doesn't like something, will tear anyone to pieces. But then a dissonance arose in the knights' heads, as a small girl also passed between them and followed the huge guy. She didn't even pay attention to them as she ran past. But after walking a little further, May asked why these people were staring at Alshia like that. He replied that he himself did not know. However, it seemed to him that they wanted to start a fight with him. One of the players seemed familiar to the guy, but it was a pity that he couldn't remember him. May replied that in that case, this moment was not so important to remember. When Alshia and her assistant retreated to a safe distance, the guild leader suggested that this guy might be a ranker. The leader couldn't answer the question of why he was just standing there and looking at this big guy, but he felt that this was far from an ordinary player. Although it still turns out strange since he went alone and did not die in this area. Worcester couldn't believe that this was possible, but the leader replied that he was sure of one thing: he shouldn't be provoked. But Worcester was also interested in getting his shield back. The leader replied that he would return it, but now was not the right time for that. Their next meeting would be carefully prepared, and for that, they would first need to announce to everyone in the guild that this guy should be followed. It was good that the guild's problems had not yet affected Alshia, who continued on his way. The next points on the map were the field, and then the deserts. The spirit of life told the guy about a place called Elysia, where Alshia and his assistant headed. Unfortunately, there was no information on the forum about what they were talking about now. Therefore, the guy decided for himself that first they should get out of the desert, and May did not object to this outcome of events. Suddenly, the girl noticed something strange and pointed at it with her finger, calling Alshia. It was as if she had noticed a real oasis in the middle of the desert. Alshia happily added that there might be a whole village near this place, so they should hurry to get there. The guy ran first, and May barely kept up with him, but continued to run. Eventually, the sandstorm obscured Alshia's silhouette, leaving the girl disoriented and lost. Alshia couldn't understand where such a sudden sandstorm came from. But as soon as the sand cleared, the guy noticed that Aziz was missing. He thought it was just a mirage, but his thoughts were distracted by May's screams, who ran as fast as she could towards the guy, asking if he was okay. Running closer, the girl, noticing that there was no oasis, also stared into the distance in surprise and stopped, and Alshia still could not understand how something so real could seem to them. In general, the guy began to think that the dunes were getting higher and higher. In these thoughts, he did not even hear May's cries calling him. She wanted to warn him that there was a real sand crater under the guy's feet, but she didn't have time because he started to get sucked in. Alshia began to panic as he realized that he could not get out and that an irresistible force was pulling him down. The guy tried to cling to the sand, but it was useless. But surprisingly, in this way, a secret entrance to the dungeon was found. After some time, the funnel stopped sucking in sand. When she stopped, May came closer and began to watch her closely. She tried to contact Alshia through the system and whisper functions, but nothing worked, as if there was no connection. Then the girl realized that she was left completely alone in the empty desert. In the middle of this desert, where there is sand all around, it is easy to go crazy. She realized that she might have to fall down too to find Alshia. At this time, the guy fell down from a strange hole in the ceiling, discovering a secret dungeon, which increased his reputation. Everything around was as if Alshia had found himself inside a pyramid, dark brown bricks, and a pile of sand. It was pouring out of every crack, and from one of them it fell right on the head of the guy, who still didn't understand where he was. Standing on his feet from the pile of sand, he was surprised by the huge corridor he found himself in. Suddenly he heard some strange sounds and decided to check what was there. The source of the noise was behind the huge wooden doors. Suddenly there was a very loud knock on the door, after which they swung open, and on the threshold stood armed men who were going to destroy some tyrant Brezal. Alshia couldn't understand what was going on here, and even more so, he was perplexed as to why they considered him some kind of strange tyrant. But his thoughts had to be put on the back burner, as the rebel army of the Kingdom of Copeia was already rushing towards the guy, wanting to attack. They were ready to destroy the tyrant for the honor of their homeland, but then the rebel running ahead stopped and stared at Jeho. He was a little scared and stood in a fighting stance with an aggressive expression on his face. The rebels, looking at the guy who emanated a creepy aura, decided to hold off on the attack. Then the chief rebel, thinking that this was no ordinary guy, asked if he was Brezal's new servant. Then, from somewhere above, a prolonged laugh was heard, and a voice mockingly said that these little people still could not come to terms with their fate. It was the voice of a certain Brezal, whom these people hated, shouting that today his reign would come to an end, since they would overthrow him from the throne and defeat the curse. But Brezal was sure that no matter how hard they tried, they would still remain his faithful slaves. Then, a new system notification about a sudden quest popped up in front of Alshia. The system explained that Brezal was the king of the ancient kingdom of Capea, who had always wanted a luxurious life. His greed went beyond the bounds of what was permitted, which made the inhabitants of Cope victims of their ruler, who died in poverty and devastation. One day, the people rebelled against Brezal, but were cursed and locked in a time loop. So now the guy had to make a choice about what he was going to do, but then his introduction to the quest was interrupted by one of the rebels, who called Alshia. He said that the tyrant Brezal was the one who devastated their lands, so they would be glad to have the guy help them restore justice. The rebel was willing to share his power with this guy, but Alshia still had a choice. He could help the rebels defeat Brezal and receive something unknown as a reward, or help Brezal destroy the rebels, thanks to which he could change his profession to the Defender of Time. It was like choosing between two evils, but Alshia decided to do what he wanted, and while he was deciding, something interesting was happening on the surface. There was a girl walking through the desert who contacted someone on the system and complained about the guys who ordered her to search the path from the Rockshchi forest and the Perma Desert, which distracted her from the class quest. Her name was Samantha, and she was at level 121 of the Future Sculptor class and was a member of the Prime Guild. The subscriber on the other side supported the girl Samantha, saying that putting all her affairs on hold was too big a sacrifice. Samantha was very angry and even blocked all privates, and all because of Worcester, who lost his quest stuff. This is what happens when an aluminum basin turns into a crystal vase. The girl had been in the desert for a month and had made no progress on the time guard quest she wanted to complete, but suddenly she noticed the sand around her starting to rise and realized her golem was back. It was her level 30 sand golem scout that Samantha approached and asked if he had found anything, but his search was once again unsuccessful. Samantha wondered what she should do now, but the solution came to her mind by itself. She summoned many more of her golems, which, as one, began to rise from the sand. But unfortunately, it seemed that none of them had found anything worthwhile. But suddenly one of the sand monsters turned to Samantha and said that he saw a suspicious person. Samantha immediately ran up to her mimicry to find out more information. Mimicry is a scout sand golem that imitates objects or figures it has seen before. Thus, mimicry began to transform into that strange man from the desert. The golem turned into a little sand girl and began to imitate her voice, thoughtfully saying that if the whisper function didn't work, then she should think about whether she would be able to breathe in that sand funnel if she got sucked into it. Hearing the words about the sand crater, Samantha immediately tensed up, because this was the entrance to the underground kingdom that she had been looking for so long. She ordered the golem to lead her to the place where he had seen the girl, and the monster obeyed. And while Samantha was looking for this unusual entrance to the underground, a rebellion against Brazil had already begun there. At the head of the rebellion, oddly enough, was Alshia, ready to overthrow the evil king. The rebels thanked the stranger, but Alshia himself understood that he did not like this choice. Yet Brezal's expression about a strong warrior infuriated Alshia, which made his expression even more terrifying, which did not escape the rebels' attention. The man was clearly happy to have such a formidable guy like Alshia on their side, but then a threatening and powerful voice came out of nowhere again. Brezal wanted to show his power to all the rebels, one of whom decided to cover the newcomer among them from behind. But what they all didn't expect was for the floor above them to start cracking and rising. And then a huge sand monster emerged from the ground, clearly not friendly towards the people around it. The rebel leader shouted that it was a golden sand golem, which meant it was time to get in line and hold it. But the huge golem calmly moved towards the rebels. He extended his hand towards the frightened people who looked in horror at this huge monster. Alshia was afraid for them, but the rebel leader said that those guys were not timid and would be able to get out of it. Moreover, due to Brezal's curse, they did not die, but turned into sand and were resurrected again and again. Even if the monster crushes everyone into pancakes, they will turn into ordinary sand under his feet. The squads, no matter how much they wanted to, would not go to the next world, which means they had long been drawn into an endless battle. Alshia couldn't pretend to be blind, who doesn't see how people are simply destroyed, even though they are later reborn. But, looking at the level 230 golem, the guy didn't even understand what to do and what could be done with it. But this monster came out from somewhere, and perhaps Alshia will be able to hack the quest if he goes down even lower. The boy then went straight to the hole the golem had made in the ground, causing the rebel to worry about him. The man tried to tell the stranger that Brezal was hiding behind mirages in a completely different direction, but Alshia continued to walk forward. And then, not wanting to waste any more time, he rushed at a run towards his goal, which caused bewilderment in the rebel. He kept trying to stop the guy, but he didn't even hear him anymore. Alshia understood that there was no other exit to this dungeon except the gates they had passed through. This means that the rest is in the hole where the golem came out and where the guy was heading. Running very close, Alshia jumped up, as if wanting to dive into this hole. The rebel couldn't believe his eyes and didn't understand what was wrong with this fool, but the guy had already dissolved into the darkness that emanated from the deep hole. The system used the Have Wings to Fall achievement to reduce the player's fall damage. Alshia landed successfully and, getting to his feet, headed forward, where, although it was dark, the general outlines of objects were visible, which can't be said about anything specific since not everything was visible ahead. But, having gone a little further, the system reported that Alshia had found Brazal's secret warehouse. Then, from somewhere, a very strange sound was heard which made the guy wary. Suddenly he saw in the darkness in front of him strange, equally dark outlines of bodies in robes that began to move. Taking a closer look, Alshia realized that in front of him were real skeletons, lifeless knights of the ruined kingdom of level 85. They were of a higher level than the guy had expected, which made him tense up. Moreover, Alshia realized that skeletons are much slower than bears, which means they can be defeated with one interesting item from the inventory. Armed with his favorite weapon, the seed of the Tree of Life, the guy was sure that he would level up. Eventually, a tough fight ensued between the boy and the skeletons. The seed strikes were strong enough to defeat the enemies. The system suddenly showed that the spiritual power of the divine tree seed was causing additional damage, so it wasn't difficult for Alshia to notice the next enemy and attack him. He only squeezed the seed tighter in his hand to make the blow more accurate, and then he cut off the skeleton's head with one blow, thanks to which he leveled up his character. The guy looked at the remaining skeletons and thought that they were too slow and fighting them was too boring. The spiritual power of the Tree of Life seed had a strong effect on the enemy's condition, which Alshia honestly did not expect. The guy didn't even feel that true taste of battle, but he decided that leveling up wouldn't be superfluous. But then Alshia heard a strange sound of heavy footsteps, and then came the sound of a hoarse voice asking the guy to stop destroying the skeletons. After this, the sound of iron scraping against the ground was heard, and the voice continued speaking. The boys stared at the large figure emerging from the shadows. The creature looked like a monster, repeating that the skeletons were not to blame, and that it was all because of the curse that left them with only instincts. Trying to justify his charges, the huge skeleton stared at Alshia with empty eyes. He was a level 135 captive guard captain, and his size was much larger than the other skeletons. Alshia was scared when he saw this big guy, and was no longer sure that he would be able to destroy him even with the help of the seed. But suddenly the skeleton turned to the stranger and said that the tyrant Brazal, blinded by greed, did what no man should do. He brought down a curse. He himself enjoyed a life of luxury, sacrificing ordinary people. Alshia suggested that this was why the rebellion began. But the skeleton continued, saying that Brazal's subjects were trapped in time, and now they had no choice but to fight again and again to prevent the curse from being released. Then Alshia asked the captain of the guard directly if he was going to fight him. He replied that some time ago his mind had been clouded, but he still zealously defended this place. But then suddenly he felt the presence of a living soul, the carrier of which was Alshia. The living soul helped the skeleton to wake up. All this was due to the spirit of life, which began to put on airs because of this. But Alshia was still grateful to him, as he was able to awaken the captain of the fallen guard, who explained the whole situation to him. Then the guy realized that there was no point in fighting with the captain and his guard, which he confirmed, and nevertheless said that he had one request for the stranger. The guy looked at the captain with interest, not even imagining what he might ask him. And at that moment, the system opened an additional quest for Alshia, which said that the captain of the guard, who had previously protected the secret warehouse of the tyrant Brazal, wanted to stop the effect of the curse. And the quest was to go with the captain to the very heart of the dungeon, to which the guy, albeit without much pleasure, agreed. Eventually, they reached a huge yellow gate. The captain touched them with his hand and pressed the door to open it. Even through a small crack, large reserves of something golden could be seen in a large room. When the door opened fully, Alshia was stunned by what he saw in front of him. Before him was a whole sea of untold treasures. The skeleton said that this was the dungeon of the Copeia kingdom, a boundless gold mine. If you take advantage of all this, you can succeed greatly. But Brazal did not want to leave everything to his descendants. He also sacrificed the souls of his subjects to demons, which is why the kingdom of Copeia became a desert. This vile little man had made a deal at his own expense, suffering daily from the fear of losing his authority. In Alshia's opinion, this Brazal was absolutely pathetic. But then the captain said that it was time for them to say goodbye, since only a man could go further. It was a strange little entrance, like a cave in a treasury. The passage was very narrow, but the guy was ready to go to the center of the dungeon. The only thing that interested him was what to do when he got to this center. But the captain replied that, unfortunately, he could no longer help, and now the future depended only on Alshia himself. The captain's last parting words were that, at the moment the hourglass turns, everything will return to the beginning. Alshia looked questioningly at the skeleton and replied that he would go to the center of the dungeon in any case. As he set off, the boy noticed that the dungeon was becoming narrower and narrower. But then he noticed a door at the end of the tunnel. Approaching her, the guy realized that the door was not locked, after which he opened it slightly. Alshia's curiosity overcame his fear, and he went inside. Around the door there were stone walls, and in the room itself, in its very center, there was something very strange. A clot of reddish energy hung above the ground, which was the center of the dungeon. There was a huge magic circle on the floor, and something strange was hovering above it. It was the same hourglass that the captain had mentioned. Alshia was delighted to see them, deciding that he could just take them now. But as soon as he took a step forward, the guy felt strange vibrations on the ground. Then he looked down, thinking he had stepped on something. But it was a strange energy that did not let Alshia go any further. The curse of the dead tried to affect him, because of which the boy's recovery power was reduced by 90%. Alshia's health also began to rapidly decrease, which was very similar to one feature in all games, debuff, that is, an instant decrease in all stats. The spirit of life, which resisted negative effects, tried to help the guy. It gave the guy a passive class ability of life charge, meaning that an abundant flow of life will constantly restore the shaman's health. The second skill, resistance to curse, protected from the influence of evil forces and had two effects. Firstly, it reduced the power of all curses associated with demons by 80%. And secondly, it caused immunity to the abnormal state caused by curses. The spirit of life boasted of its resourcefulness, while the boy quickly thanked it. Passive skills were just right now, since with them it became possible to pass this test. Staring at the center of the dungeon, the guy confidently decided that he would achieve his goal. All this time, while Alshia was struggling with the curses, the captain of the fallen guard was watching the entrance to the cave. He couldn't believe that the boy had come this far with his vitality. There were not even immortals who could overcome the curse of demons with an ordinary body. But then the skeleton felt a strange vibration throughout the room, and this meant only one thing. Alshia was approaching his goal. He used legendary recovery items such as the Morning Dew Apple, which increased recovery speed by 150%, or the Elven Spinach Pie, which restored damage taken using the powers of nature and increased curse resistance by 200%, or the Blue Makgeolli, made by spirits, which restored strength in case of death or critical damage, but only once. Alshia understood that if he used all these products given to him by the elves, he would be able to complete the mission. Moreover, he received the Zombie achievement, which reduced the damage taken by 1%. In the end, he almost managed to reach the flying hourglass. The guy even reached out his hand to grab them, and it was only a little bit left to do so. As soon as he touched this magical clock, the system notified the player that the time that had been stopped had begun to move. Thus, the seal of Kapi was removed, and Alshia, taking the watch in his hand, began to think about what was about to happen. Then he felt strong vibrations throughout the room. It felt like an earthquake had started, but Pereno felt like something was collapsing from above. Looking up, he saw small stones falling and heard, strangely enough, the sound of water. Then it dawned on Alshia that this underground cave was most likely once water. At that moment, the captain of the fallen guard, who was standing outside, realized that Alshia had managed to do it and broke the curse. First, his hand began to disintegrate into small pieces, and then his whole body. The skeleton understood that freedom was finally waiting for him, and this joyful thought made him want to cry. But for Alshia, the situation was not so joyful and pleasant. The boy saw water seeping through the walls of the cave. The hole through which it was pouring grew larger and larger. Eventually, a huge stream of water fell like a waterfall right next to Alshia. The guy understood that things were bad because he would be carried away onto the ferry. Then he realized that it was time to get out of here and rushed to the door. The water caught up with him and was getting closer and closer to Alshia, who was running away from it down the corridor as fast as he could. The entrance to the cave was not blocked by anything, only now there was no one and nothing near it except whole mountains of treasures. And then suddenly a huge stream of water poured out of this small passage. She washed away a large quantity of gold coins and other treasures. A few moments later, Alshia emerged from the water mixed with gold. Here, a new notification popped up about a new achievement Alshia had received, seeing a sea dragon, which increased the guy's ability to drive, after which he realized that this was not all. Right in front of him, the water rose up, forming a huge splash. This splash became a real wave that swallowed Alshia completely. The lack of oxygen underwater had a negative effect on the player's health indicator. But, nevertheless, Alshia got the achievement of the empty bottle, which increased the agility of the boy in the water environment. But the water continued to break through the walls around. A huge amount of water gushed out of another wall. The guy was only just now able to emerge from the previous wave that had washed over him, when a new one appeared. It was even bigger than the previous one, as it even destroyed part of the wall. But the guy only now realized that he didn't know where he was, since the wave had carried him to a completely different place. Here Alshia heard the familiar but dissatisfied voice of Brazal. Thus, Alshia accidentally found the ruler of the kingdom of Kopei. A large silhouette sitting on the throne asked the guy how he dared to come here. Alshia tried to say something in his defense, but didn't have time. Brazal started calling the guy all sorts of horrible names, and at some point he even stopped understanding whether this Brazal was talking to him. Taking a closer look, the guy saw another skeleton in royal attire on the throne. For Alshia, it was quite a contradiction that the owner of the treasure was a skeleton. It turns out that his appearance was the result of a curse he received for making a deal with demons. At this point, the skeleton began to rise from the throne, simultaneously ordering Alshia not to look at him, especially so intently because it embarrassed him. At this moment, the guy was completely confused and did not know what to answer and where to look. The guy felt a little uncomfortable and funny, but Brazal didn't like that he was making fun of him. And then he ordered the guy to give him the watch, which, somehow, ended up in his hands. After these words, the skeleton reached for his saber lying nearby. And then he began to go down to Alshia, saying that the guy must quietly and peacefully return what was stolen, and only then will he remain alive. At first, Alshia didn't understand what Brazal was talking about. But then the realization suddenly dawned on him that this was the very same hourglass. But the guy didn't have them with him, and he thought that they were simply washed away by the stream. But then he remembered that he had put the watch in his inventory and was about to take it out, when suddenly a question arose in his head. Why should he give it to this half-dead skeleton? But he began to boil and was already seriously angry. He started running towards the guy and repeating that he needed a watch. The skeleton swung and struck with his sword, but Alshia was too quick to jump aside. However, the agility of this decrepit old man surprised the guy. But that didn't change the fact that he was literally falling apart. With each movement he made, the pieces flew off the skeleton more and more. Alshia only now realized what the inscription about the frozen clock meant, because when he took possession of it, time began to return to its original state. Brazal was no exception, so he would soon become completely weakened, and it would be easy to defeat him. But Brazal's level and health were unknown, and were not displayed in the system notification. And while the guy was trying to figure it out, the skeleton attacked him again. Alshia barely managed to dodge, but Brazal still missed. The skeleton then struck the defenseless boy again, but he dodged again. This began to anger Brazal, which caused him to attack more and more actively. The guy understood that he had come across a strong opponent, so he should avoid taking damage from him. The skeleton had no intention of stopping and uttering threats in his hoarse and creepy voice. In the end, he decided to use the Curse of the Dead as a last chance to hit the enemy. This curse has exceeded the limit of the curse resistance ability, and the Touch of the Dead has limited the movement speed, and the attack has decreased proportionally. Alshia wondered how high the skeleton's level was that passive abilities couldn't cope with his strength. If the fight continued like this, the guy would simply die. But then his gaze caught something curious. It was a vine that grew through the rocks. The guy immediately decided to use the fast growth skill. After this, the plant's growth rate increased several times and the vine began to grow. Since time in the Kopei kingdom has been accelerated to its normal speed, it has an effect on the fast growth skill. Thanks to this, Alshia has obtained the fast growth change skill. The plant began to grow 500% faster and enveloped Brazal from all sides. The flower was already several times larger than its usual size, but the duration of this effect was only 20 seconds. However, this was enough for Alshia to figure out what to do next. The skeleton laughed, because he was sure that such a pathetic trick would not defeat him. But the guy, taking an hourglass out of his inventory, said that he just needed to buy a little time. At this time, the sand in the hourglass had almost been poured from one glass to another. Seeing this, Brazal began to panic and tried to break free. But then he heard Alshia's surprised voice. He pointed to the skeleton and said he could see its ribs. The skeleton immediately became embarrassed and ordered Alshia not to look at him, but that was all the guy needed. Time was running out and the last grain of sand fell to the other side of the clock. In the end, all the sand ended up on one side, meaning the goal was achieved. The skeleton's empty eyes began to express fear as much as possible. He began to disintegrate into pieces, as if dissolving into thin air and disappearing. In the end, all that was left of him was the royal cloak and the echo of his last screams. Thus, the tyrant Brazal was defeated, and the goal of the task was achieved. But since the quest was not completed by a battle, the experience received for completing it will be reduced, but the character's level still increased. The guy was happy, but suddenly he saw another notification that the demon Kalido was smiling at him. Alshia didn't know who it was and decided it wasn't important enough to pay attention to. But suddenly, out of the corner of his eye, he noticed something interesting on the floor. It was the legendary class crown that skeleton, Brazal, wore. But this item could only be used by the king of the Kopei kingdom, and if you put it on, you can become the new king. Alshia stared at the beautiful golden crown in silence. The thought of becoming the new king was on his mind, as his father wanted it. And while the guy stood there and thought, May was still trying to open the passage to the dungeon. She tore the endless sand with her hands and called out to Alshia Nima. Then the sand in front of her began to rise on its own, as if something was growing from underneath it. The girl first thought it was Alshia, but a real small golem appeared from the sand. May screamed and tried to jump away from the sand monster. But then, kneeling down, she recognized this unusual stranger as a sand golem and calmed down a little as fear gave way to curiosity. But then the golem began to approach her, and the girl began to tremble again and scream, then told May that she looked a little strange, so he decided to make sure of something. Then the golem raised its hands up and decided to use the sand replacement skill. In May's opinion, it looked very creepy. But then the golem began to melt and the sand began to crumble, deforming it. The girl looked in surprise as a female silhouette appeared from the sand. Only now did it dawn on her that there was a person inside the golem, and it was a girl. But she, looking at May with a bored look, said that, as she thought, he was an ordinary noob. Then she asked May who she was and what she was doing here. But the girl didn't pay attention to her questions, since all of May's interest was taken up by the leopard top on the stranger. Then she turned away and whispered that it looked completely tasteless, although the girl herself looked quite dangerous. And while May was dealing with the stranger who had suddenly appeared, Alshia was still in the dungeon, holding 2 boss items in his hands, an hourglass and a crown. The legendary class Frozen Desert Hourglass was a reminder of the contract once made between the last king and the demon, containing the power of the great demon Kalido. Thanks to this, Mirage soldiers and the Golden Golem can be summoned. The Crown of Brezal of the legendary class gave the player the opportunity to become a king, but the neighboring states were currently hostile to the kingdom of Kopei due to the local ruler's communication with otherworldly forces. If the player decides to revive the king, most countries will become enemies of the Kopei kingdom. This question troubled Alshia, and he did not know what to do with this information. His instinct for self-preservation told him that it was better not to rush into a decision, although he couldn't throw these things away either. The guy decided to look for another way to use these items. Looking around, Alshia realized that the area of the hall he was in was quite large, but the water had already filled almost the entire space. It turns out that the Perm Desert was not a desert to begin with, and if Alshia is right, he can revive this lost place. This is how Shaman Talayat grew a forest of rocks on barren land. The Spirit of Life said that if Alshia goes to Elysia, she will be able to revive the divine tree, but there was no information on the forum about a place with this name. In this case, it is necessary to write the story of Elysia yourself, which is what Alshia will do. The Spirit of Life decided to question this decision, but the guy replied that he was a shaman and could do whatever he wanted. In addition, the Hourglass provides free labor in the form of warriors trapped in a time loop. The Spirit of Life wanted to warn that one should not exploit the dead for one's own purposes, but Alshia seemed to become obsessed with the idea of creating his own flower garden in this place. We had to try it to see what would happen, and now the new world was in the hands of Alshia, who finally put the crown on himself. As soon as he did so, a strange sensation pierced him, and a bright light appeared in front of him. Thus, Alshia became the first player to achieve the status of king. The player's reputation increased for getting the achievements King of the Beginning and Successor of the Tyrant, which greatly flattered Alshia. The system said that he could now revive the kingdom of Kopei or create his own. If it became known that the player had inherited the title from the cursed king, his bad reputation would increase. But Alshia realized that he did not need rumors, so he decided to do something else. Then the boy called upon the Mirage soldiers to come to him. He hoped that they would become a labor force for him, but nothing happened. The system said that Alshia's level is too low to summon, and what's more, the water level around it makes it difficult to materialize, so only 2 soldiers can be mobilized. The guy wasn't happy with this arrangement, so he decided to summon a golden golem, but at his current level, even that turned out to be impossible. Moreover, it was impossible to awaken a golem without mana. Then, Alshia thought about something he had never thought about before, increasing the level and amount of mana. Then the guy decided to start by looking for a way out of this half-flooded cave. And while he was looking for a way out, May, who was trying to open it, told Samantha about her partner and that he was simply sucked into a sand funnel. It sounded like a fairy tale, and May's presence here raised even more questions, and Samantha was most interested in why the girl wasn't sucked in along with her partner. Samantha assumed that Alshia had done something, but May responded that the guy was just waving his hands, and then decided to fake it. Samantha was sure that May was hiding something, and wanted to know all the details. But then the girls looked at each other in fear, feeling a strange vibration throughout the desert. Samantha immediately pounced on May, thinking that it was her doing, but the girl, frightened, began to make excuses and say that she did nothing. Here the girls noticed that something began to rise from the sand to the surface. Samantha was sure that they were golems, so she prepared for battle. But then her gaze changed from aggressive to surprised when she saw a huge guy with a crown on his head in front of her. He seemed to fly out of the sand and, like a god, appeared to the people as the new ruler of the kingdom of Kope. Also, after the victory of Alshia, the cursed dungeon of Kope was opened. Seeing the girl's surprised looks, Alshia became slightly embarrassed, as he had appeared too pompously. May turned to Alshia with surprised eyes and said that she was very glad that he was more than okay. Samantha immediately realized that the announcement on behalf of the guild warned about this guy, whose face gave him away. Alshia, seeing Samantha, became aggressive and, covering May, asked who she was. Was she really another dead person? But May said that the only dead person here was the leopard top in their time. Samantha realized that their commander was not joking when he spoke about the terrible expression on the giant's face. Then the girl, stuttering, turned to Alshia, trying to find out who he was. But she was more interested in the crown of Brazil on the guy, who, in turn, was surprised, since the girl knew about it from somewhere. Samantha immediately pointed her sword at Alshia and asked how the guy got this crown, but he replied that it would take too long to tell, about 4 chapters. Samantha shouted that the Timekeeper was a unique class that she was supposed to receive along with Brazil's favor. But Alshia suddenly said that he had completed the alternative quest and destroyed Brazil, which shocked the girl. She realized that she had lost the opportunity to get her long-awaited unique class. It was a real loss of a dream for her, but Alshia only confirmed her fears, saying that the title of King of Kopi had now passed to him. Samantha was still shocked and couldn't get over this information. The only thing she understood was that now her class promotion directly depended on this big guy who had become the new king. But then the system showed Samantha a notification that after the death of the tyrant Brazil, a new king had appeared, and if the girl managed to earn his trust, she would be rewarded. Samantha was dismayed that the reward could only be obtained through the king's favor. At this moment, Alshia was ready to challenge the girl to a duel, but she realized that this was not to her advantage, so she knelt down and thus paid her respects to the king, congratulating him on his coronation. At first, Alshia did not understand why the girl knelt before him, and why her attitude towards him changed so much in one moment. It was really against Samantha's character to endure these humiliations in order to gain trust. May watched this whole circus and wondered what was going on. Then she also decided to kneel before Alshia and congratulate the guy, even though he said that she shouldn't have done it. Alshia himself did not understand at all how everything could have come to this, and completely by accident. However, all this time, 2 guys, Wooster and the guild leader, were looking for Samantha and suddenly noticed 3 figures in the middle of the desert. At first, they thought it was just a mirage, but then they recognized Samantha among the silhouettes. One of them thought that the girl had betrayed them, but the second guy assumed that this was not the case, since her class allowed her to create up to 3 copies of herself. Besides, Samantha is too proud and would never kneel down and continue to resist, regardless of the level of the opponent. Wooster and Bamboo Cane stared at the guy who was wearing a crown and looked very scary.